Welcome, and thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most remarkable periods in human history. Tonight, we travel back to the Italian peninsula, to an age when artists became legends, when merchants built empires of trade and culture, and when the very nature of what it meant to be human was reimagined and reborn. This is the story of Renaissance Italy. Find yourself a comfortable position now. Let your body settle into stillness. Allow your breathing to become slow and natural. As we travel together through the centuries, through the marble halls of Florence and the canals of Venice, through the workshops of artists and the counting houses of bankers, let the gentle rhythm of this narrative carry you toward peaceful rest. The word Renaissance comes from the French word, meaning rebirth, and rebirth is precisely what occurred in Italy between the 14th and 16th centuries. It was a rebirth of learning, of art, of science, and of the human spirit itself. Ideas that had slumbered for over 1,000 years awakened once more, and when they did, they transformed not only Italy, but eventually all of Western civilization. But this transformation did not happen suddenly. It did not arrive like a thunderclap or a conquering army. Instead, it grew slowly, organically, like a garden tended by countless hands across many generations. To understand how this remarkable age came to be, we must first understand the world from which it emerged. As the 13th century drew to a close, the Italian peninsula was unlike any other region in Europe. It was a land of cities, of commerce, and of extraordinary diversity. While much of Europe remained organized around the feudal system of lords and peasants, of castles and agricultural estates, Italy had developed along a different path entirely. The geography of Italy played a crucial role in this distinctive development. The long peninsula, extending far into the Mediterranean Sea, was ideally positioned for maritime trade. To the east lay the Byzantine Empire, and beyond it the wealthy markets of Asia. To the south stretched the coast of North Africa. To the west, the maritime routes led to Spain, France, and eventually to the Atlantic world that would later emerge. This geographic advantage had been recognized even in ancient times. The Romans had built their great empire from this peninsula, and though that empire had fallen centuries before, its legacy remained embedded in the Italian landscape. Roman roads still crossed the countryside. Roman aqueducts still carried water to some cities, and Roman ideas about law, governance, and civilization still echoed in the minds of educated Italians. But the Italy of the late Middle Ages was not a unified nation. Indeed, the concept of Italy as a single political entity would not truly emerge for another 500 years. Instead, the peninsula was divided among dozens of independent states, each with its own government, its own laws, and its own distinct character. In the north, wealthy city-states dominated the landscape. Milan controlled the fertile plains of Lombardy. Venice ruled a maritime empire that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. Genoa competed with Venice for control of trade routes. Florence had grown rich from banking and the wool trade. And dozens of smaller cities, each with its own traditions and ambitions, filled the spaces between these major powers. In the center of the peninsula, the Papal States formed a band of territory ruled by the Pope in Rome. The Church remained one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe, and its temporal control over central Italy gave the papacy enormous political as well as spiritual influence. To the south, the Kingdom of Naples occupied the lower portion of the peninsula and the island of Sicily. This southern kingdom had a different character from the city-states of the north. It was more traditionally feudal, with large agricultural estates worked by peasants under the authority of noble landlords. The south had been ruled successively by Normans, Germans, and finally the French House of Anjou, giving it a more mixed cultural heritage. This political fragmentation might seem like a weakness, and in some ways it was. The Italian states were constantly at war with one another, forming and breaking alliances, competing for territory and influence. But this very competition also drove innovation. Each city sought advantages over its rivals, whether in military technology, commercial practices, or cultural achievements. The absence of a single dominant power meant that artists, scholars, and entrepreneurs could move from city to city, finding patrons and opportunities wherever conditions were most favorable. To understand the Renaissance, we must understand how the Italian cities governed themselves, for their political structures were as innovative as their art and commerce. Most of the major city-states of northern and central Italy had developed as communes, a form of government quite unlike the monarchies and feudal hierarchies that dominated the rest of Europe. The commune was, in essence, a self-governing corporation of citizens. Its origins lay in the 11th and 12th centuries, when Italian cities began to assert their independence from feudal lords and bishops. The rising merchant class, grown wealthy from trade, demanded a voice in the governance of their cities. They formed sworn associations, taking oaths of mutual support and creating councils to manage civic affairs. Over time, these councils became increasingly sophisticated. Most communes developed complex systems of government designed to prevent any single individual or family from gaining too much power. Officials served short terms, often just 2 or 6 months. Multiple councils balanced each other's authority. Elaborate rules governed who could hold office and how decisions were made. Florence, which would become the very heart of the Renaissance, developed one of the most complex communal governments. The city was divided into quarters, and then into smaller neighborhoods called gonfaloni. Various guilds, representing different trades and professions, also played a role in governance. Citizens served on rotating councils, and the highest executive office, the signoria, consisted of 9 members called priors who served for only 2 months at a time. This system was designed to ensure that power remained diffused among the citizen body, rather than concentrated in any single hand. It reflected values that would become central to Renaissance thought: the importance of civic participation, the danger of tyranny, and the belief that citizens had both the right and the duty to govern themselves. Not all Italian cities maintained their republican governments throughout the Renaissance period. Many eventually fell under the control of powerful families who became hereditary rulers, though often maintaining the outward forms of republican government. Milan came under the rule of the Visconti, and later the Sforza families. Ferrara was governed by the Este family. Mantua by the Gonzagas. Even Florence, despite its elaborate republican constitution, would eventually be dominated by the Medici family, though they too maintained the fiction of republican rule for many decades. Whether republican or ruled by powerful families, the Italian city-states shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from the rest of Europe. They were urban, they were commercial, and they were intensely competitive, not only in trade and warfare, but in culture and learning as well. The wealth that made the Renaissance possible came primarily from commerce. In the centuries before the Renaissance, Italian merchants had transformed the nature of European trade, developing financial techniques and business practices that laid the foundation for modern capitalism. The Crusades, which had begun in 1095 and continued in various forms for over 2 centuries, had opened European eyes to the wealth of the East. Crusaders returning home brought back not only tales of distant lands, but also a taste for luxury goods that could only be obtained from Asia. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, silks and fine textiles, precious stones and exotic materials of all kinds. Italian merchants, particularly those of Venice and Genoa, positioned themselves as the middlemen of this lucrative trade. They established trading posts throughout the eastern Mediterranean, negotiated agreements with Muslim and Byzantine rulers, and built fleets capable of carrying vast quantities of goods across the seas. But it was not only in long-distance trade that Italian merchants innovated. They also developed new financial instruments that made commerce more efficient and profitable. The bill of exchange allowed the merchants to transfer large sums of money across great distances without physically moving gold or silver. Double-entry bookkeeping, which may have been invented in Italy during the 14th century, allowed for more precise tracking of profits and losses. Insurance contracts spread the risk of maritime trade among multiple investors. Perhaps most importantly, Italian merchants developed banking to a degree unprecedented in medieval Europe. The word bank itself comes from the Italian banco, the bench or table where money changers conducted their business. Italian bankers, particularly those of Florence, became financiers to the entire continent. They lent money to kings and popes, financed wars and building projects, and accumulated enormous wealth in the process. The Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence were among the greatest bankers of the early 14th century. They lent vast sums to Edward III of England to finance his wars with France. When Edward defaulted on these loans in the 1340s, both banking houses collapsed, triggering a financial crisis that rippled across Europe. But even this disaster did not diminish Florence's position as the banking capital of Europe. New families rose to take the place of those who had fallen, and the most successful of all would be the Medici. The wealth generated by this commercial revolution had profound social consequences. In most of Europe, social status depended primarily on birth. Noble families held power because their ancestors had held power, and the line between nobles and commoners was sharply drawn. But in the Italian city-states, wealth began to rival birth as a source of social standing. Successful merchants could rise to positions of power and influence that would have been unthinkable in feudal society. They could build grand palaces, commission works of art, endow charitable institutions, and marry their children into noble families. This social mobility, though still limited by modern standards, created a more dynamic society than existed elsewhere in Europe. It also created a class of wealthy patrons who would become the great sponsors of Renaissance art and culture. As the 14th century reached its midpoint, disaster struck. The Black Death, the great pandemic of bubonic plague, arrived in Italy in 1347, carried by merchant ships from the east. Within 3 years, it had killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. Some Italian cities lost half their inhabitants or more. The plague struck with terrifying speed. A person might feel healthy in the morning and be dead by evening. The symptoms were horrific fever, chills, and most distinctively, the buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck that gave the disease its name. Once the symptoms appeared, death usually followed within days. The social fabric of cities tore apart under the pressure of the epidemic. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague firsthand, described the breakdown of normal human relationships. Parents abandoned sick children. The dead went unburied. Those who could fled to the countryside, though the plague often followed them there. The psychological impact of the Black Death was enormous and long-lasting. The sudden, arbitrary nature of death on such a massive scale challenged conventional understandings of both religion and society. If God controlled the universe, why had he permitted such a catastrophe? If social institutions could not protect people from death, what was their value? Some responded to these questions with religious fervor. The flagellants, groups of penitents who publicly whipped themselves, appeared in many Italian cities, hoping to appease divine wrath through suffering. Others turned to persecution, blaming Jews, foreigners, or other marginalized groups for poisoning wells or otherwise causing the plague. Still others responded with something approaching nihilism, abandoning moral and religious constraints in the face of what seemed like imminent death. But the Black Death also had consequences that, paradoxically, would help give rise to the Renaissance. With population dramatically reduced, labor became scarce and therefore more valuable. Wages rose. Serfs and peasants gained bargaining power they had never possessed before. Some of the rigid social structures of medieval Europe began to loosen. For those who survived, the reduction in population also meant greater inheritance. Land and wealth became concentrated in fewer hands. The decades following the Black Death saw the emergence of new fortunes and new social mobility. Families that had been prosperous became wealthy. Families that had been wealthy became extraordinarily rich. This concentration of wealth in the hands of a relatively small number of families created the conditions for the cultural patronage that would define the Renaissance. The great banking families, the successful merchants, the powerful princes who emerged in the post-plague decades had both the resources and the motivation to spend lavishly on art, architecture, and learning. Throughout the Middle Ages, the legacy of ancient Rome had never entirely disappeared from Italy. Romans walked past ancient ruins every day. Latin remained the language of the church and of scholarship. Some ancient texts had been preserved in monastery libraries, copied by generations of monks. But in the medieval worldview, ancient civilization was valued primarily as a precursor to Christianity. The achievements of pagan Rome and Greece were interesting mainly insofar as they pointed toward or prepared the way for Christian truth. Ancient philosophy was studied, when it was studied at all, to demonstrate its compatibility with Christian theology or to identify its errors. In the 14th century, a new attitude toward antiquity began to emerge, first in Italy, and then spreading to the rest of Europe. Scholars began to see ancient civilization not merely as a stepping stone to Christianity, but as a remarkable achievement in its own right, worthy of study and even imitation. The man most often credited with initiating this change in attitude was Francesco Petrarca, known in English as Petrarch. Born in 1304 in Arezzo, Petrarch was trained as a lawyer but devoted his life to literature and scholarship. He became obsessed with recovering and preserving the texts of ancient Rome, traveling throughout Europe in search of forgotten manuscripts. Petrarch approached ancient texts with a new kind of attention. Rather than mining them for isolated passages that could be reconciled with Christian doctrine, he sought to understand them in their original context, to appreciate their literary qualities, and to learn from the worldview they expressed. He developed a passionate admiration for Cicero, the great Roman orator, whose letters he discovered in 1345 in a library in Verona. For Petrarch, the ancient Romans were not primitive pagans groping toward truths that Christianity would later reveal. They were civilized, eloquent, and in many ways admirable people whose achievements had been lost during the dark centuries that followed the fall of Rome. Petrarch was, in fact, the first to characterize the medieval period as a dark age, a time of cultural decline separating the brilliance of antiquity from what he hoped would be a new age of cultural renewal. Petrarch's enthusiasm for antiquity proved contagious. He corresponded with scholars throughout Europe, inspiring them with his vision of cultural rebirth. He trained younger scholars in his methods of textual analysis and historical understanding, and he demonstrated through his own poetry that modern writers could rival the ancients in literary achievement. The generation following Petrarch saw an explosion of scholarly activity devoted to recovering and studying ancient texts. Humanists, as these scholars came to be called, searched libraries and monasteries throughout Europe for forgotten manuscripts. They developed new techniques for dating and authenticating texts, comparing different manuscript copies to identify errors introduced by generations of copyists. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 accelerated this process of recovery. Byzantine scholars fleeing the conquered city brought with them manuscripts of Greek texts that had been unavailable in Western Europe for centuries. The full corpus of Plato's dialogues became accessible for the first time. Lost plays of the Greek tragedians were recovered. Scientific and mathematical texts that had been preserved only in Arabic translation now became available in their original Greek. This recovery of antiquity was not merely an academic exercise. The humanists believed that ancient wisdom could guide the present. By studying how the Romans had governed their republic, modern Italians could learn to govern their own cities. By reading ancient rhetoric, modern scholars could learn to speak and write persuasively. By understanding ancient philosophy, modern thinkers could lead better lives. The humanities, a term that itself comes from the Renaissance concept of studia humanitatis or humanistic studies, emerged from this engagement with antiquity. Grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy formed the core of humanistic education. These subjects were called the humanities because they were thought to cultivate humanity itself, to develop the full potential of human nature. If any single city can be called the birthplace of the Renaissance, it is Florence. Nestled in the hills of Tuscany, straddling the Arno River, Florence in the 14th and 15th centuries became the greatest center of artistic and intellectual innovation in all of Europe. The city had grown wealthy from two industries above all, wool and banking. Florentine merchants imported raw wool from England and Spain, processed it through an elaborate sequence of workshops, and exported the finished cloth throughout Europe and beyond. The Art della Lana, the Wool Guild, was one of the most powerful organizations in the city, and its members included some of the wealthiest families in Florence. But it was banking that truly set Florence apart. Florentine bankers had established branches in every major commercial center in Europe. They financed the papacy, lending enormous sums against future revenues from church taxes and fees. They financed kings, princes, and merchants across the continent. The gold florin, the currency of Florence, became the standard of international trade, as trusted and widely accepted as the American dollar would be in a later age. This wealth translated into extraordinary civic ambition. The Florentines saw themselves as heirs to the ancient Romans, and they were determined that their city should rival Rome in greatness. They lavished resources on public buildings, churches, and works of art. They attracted artists and scholars from across Italy with generous patronage, and they cultivated a civic culture that valued excellence in every field of human endeavor. The physical appearance of Florence reflected this ambition. The cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, dominated the city skyline, its enormous dome a marvel of engineering that visitors came from far away to see. Public squares were decorated with sculpture. Churches competed to acquire the finest altarpieces. Even private homes displayed the wealth and taste of their owners through carefully designed facades and interior decorations. Walking through Florence in the 15th century, a visitor would have encountered art everywhere. Religious paintings in churches and chapels, sculptures in public spaces and private gardens, frescoes on the walls of government buildings. The city was, in a very real sense, a continuous exhibition of artistic achievement. But Florence was not merely a museum. It was a living, dynamic city, filled with the bustle of commerce and the drama of politics. The narrow streets rang with the calls of vendors, the clatter of carts, the conversation of citizens going about their daily business. The great squares, particularly the Piazza della Signoria in front of the government palace, served as stages for public ceremonies, political events, and occasionally spectacular violence. The government of Florence was, in theory, a republic, ruled by its citizens rather than by a king or prince. The reality was more complicated, but the republican ideal profoundly shaped Florentine culture and self-understanding. The Constitution of Florence was extraordinarily complex, a tangle of overlapping councils, committees, and officials that had developed over centuries. At its heart stood the Signoria, a council of 9 priors, and a gonfaloniere di giustizia, or standard-bearer of justice, who served as the chief executive. These officials served for only 2 months before being replaced, a practice designed to prevent any individual from accumulating too much power. Eligibility for office was restricted to members of the major guilds, the most powerful trade associations in the city. This meant that in practice, political power was limited to a relatively small portion of the population's successful merchants, bankers, manufacturers, and professionals. The working poor, who constituted the majority of the population, were excluded from formal politics, though they could, and sometimes did, make their voices heard through riots and demonstrations. Even among the eligible citizens, power was not evenly distributed. Certain families, through their wealth, their connections, and their political skill, exercised far more influence than others. Elections were not truly democratic. Instead, names were drawn by lot from bags containing the names of citizens deemed worthy of office. The process of determining who got into those bags was controlled by committees that were themselves subject to manipulation by powerful interests. Despite these limitations, the Florentine Republic was remarkably participatory by medieval standards. Thousands of citizens held some form of public office during their lifetimes. Debates over public policy engaged broad segments of the population, and the ideology of republicanism, the belief that free citizens governing themselves were superior to subjects of a king, became a powerful element of Florentine identity. This republican ideology drew heavily on ancient Roman models. Florentine humanists studied the histories of Livy and the speeches of Cicero, seeking lessons in how to maintain a free republic. They developed a concept of civic humanism, which held that the highest calling of an educated person was active participation in the political life of their community. Withdrawal from public affairs into private contemplation was seen not as a virtue, but as a failure of civic duty. The challenges facing the Republic provided ample opportunity for this civic engagement. Florence faced near constant threats from rival states, particularly the Duchy of Milan under the Visconti family. Internal factions competed for power, sometimes violently. Economic crises periodically destabilized the social order. Managing these challenges required the active involvement of citizens at every level. No family embodied the paradoxes of Renaissance Florence more fully than the Medici. They were bankers who became de facto princes, patrons of the arts on an unprecedented scale, and manipulators of a republican system that they dominated while pretending to be merely ordinary citizens. The Medici family had been prominent in Florence for generations, but their rise to dominance began with Giovanni di Bixi de' Medici, who built the family bank into one of the largest financial institutions in Europe in the early 15th century. Giovanni was cautious in politics, careful to avoid the appearance of excessive ambition. He lived modestly by the standards of wealthy Florentines, and he advised his sons to stay out of the public eye. Giovanni's son Cosimo did not follow this advice. Born in 1389, Cosimo di' Medici combined his father's financial genius with greater political ambition. He expanded the family bank until it had branches throughout Europe and became the primary banker of the papacy. He cultivated allies and clients across Florence, building a network of supporters that gave him enormous informal power. Cosimo's growing influence alarmed his rivals, particularly the Albizzi family, who had long been among the most powerful in Florence. In 1433, the Albizzi faction succeeded in having Cosimo arrested and exiled from the city. But Cosimo's network of supporters and the economic disruption caused by his absence led to his recall after only a year. He returned to Florence in triumph, and his enemies were now the ones forced into exile. For the remaining 30 years of his life, Cosimo dominated Florentine politics, while maintaining the fiction that Florence remained a republic of equal citizens. He held public office only occasionally and briefly. He lived in a grand, but not excessively ostentatious palace. He spoke in councils as one citizen among many, never as a ruler addressing his subjects. Yet everyone understood that Cosimo was the real power in Florence. His influence determined who held office, what policies were adopted, and how the city conducted its relations with other states. Foreign ambassadors knew that negotiations with Florence meant negotiations with Cosimo. Florentine citizens seeking favors or justice came to his palace rather than to the official government buildings. Cosimo's political power was built on a foundation of patronage. He used his vast wealth to support not only his political allies but also artists, scholars, architects, and philosophers. He commissioned buildings that transformed the appearance of Florence. He collected manuscripts and supported the scholars who studied them. He financed the Platonic Academy, a group of philosophers who gathered to discuss the works of Plato and his followers. This patronage was not merely the private hobby of a wealthy man. It was a calculated strategy for building prestige and influence. By supporting the arts and learning, Cosimo associated himself and his family with excellence and cultivation. He demonstrated his magnificence, a quality that Renaissance Italians believed both reflected and reinforced legitimate authority. And he created networks of obligation that extended throughout Florentine society and beyond. Cosimo died in 1464, having dominated Florence for 30 years without ever holding the title of ruler. His epitaph proclaimed him Pater Patrae, father of his country, a title borrowed from ancient Rome that perfectly captured the ambiguous nature of his position. He was not a king, but he was more than an ordinary citizen. Cosimo's son Piero, though he ruled Florence for only 5 years before his death, successfully passed control to his own son, Lorenzo. Known to history as Lorenzo the Magnificent, he would become the most celebrated of all the Medici, and one of the most famous figures of the Renaissance. Lorenzo was born in 1449 and raised to leadership from childhood. He received the finest education available, studying with the leading humanists of the day. He learned Greek as well as Latin, read widely in both ancient and modern literature, and developed considerable skill as a poet himself. He was trained in diplomacy, politics, and the management of the family bank, all the arts necessary for maintaining Medici power in Florence. When Lorenzo assumed leadership of the family in 1469 at the age of 20, he faced immediate challenges. The family bank, though still powerful, was not as dominant as it had been under Cosimo. Rival families chafed under Medici control, and the political situation in Italy was becoming increasingly unstable. Lorenzo proved equal to these challenges. He consolidated Medici power in Florence through a combination of political skill, personal charm, and when necessary, ruthless force. He maintained peace among the constantly feuding Italian states through skillful diplomacy, earning Florence's gratitude for avoiding costly wars. And he made himself the center of one of the most brilliant cultural courts in European history. The cultural patronage of Lorenzo the Magnificent exceeded even that of his grandfather. His palace became a gathering place for the leading artists, poets, and philosophers of the age. Sandro Botticelli painted for him. The young Michelangelo, discovered as a boy in the garden of a Medici villa, was raised virtually as a member of the family. The philosopher Marsilio Ficino continued the Platonic studies that Cosimo had sponsored. The poet Poliziano, considered the finest Latinist of his generation, served as Lorenzo's secretary and companion. Lorenzo was himself a talented poet, writing verses in Italian rather than Latin that helped establish Tuscan as a literary language. His poetry ranged from philosophical contemplation to bawdy carnival songs, reflecting the Renaissance ideal of a well-rounded individual capable of excellence in many fields. But for all his cultural achievements, Lorenzo's political legacy was mixed. The family bank declined significantly during his leadership, partly due to bad loans and mismanagement, partly due to Lorenzo's diversion of resources to political and cultural projects. His manipulation of Florentine institutions, though effective in maintaining his family's power, eroded the republican traditions that had given Florence its distinctive character. Most significantly, Lorenzo failed to anticipate the upheavals that would follow his death. He died in 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus sailed westward and encountered the Americas. Within 2 years, his son Piero, lacking his father's political skills, was driven from Florence by a popular uprising. The French invaded Italy, beginning a period of warfare that would devastate the peninsula, and a fiery Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola would briefly transform Florence into a puritanical republic that condemned the very cultural achievements the Medici had sponsored. The art of the Renaissance did not emerge suddenly from nothing. Medieval Italian painters and sculptors had created works of great beauty and spiritual power. But in Florence during the 15th century, something new happened. Artists developed techniques and ideas that transformed the nature of art itself, creating works that still astonish viewers 500 years later. The new art differed from medieval art in fundamental ways. Medieval painting tended to be flat and stylized, more concerned with conveying spiritual truths than with representing the physical world accurately. Figures were arranged according to their spiritual importance rather than their position in space. Gold backgrounds suggested the divine realm rather than the earthly landscape. The Renaissance artists of Florence developed a new approach. They sought to represent the world as it actually appeared to the eye. They studied human anatomy to portray the body accurately. They developed perspective, the mathematical system for representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. They observed light and shadow, depicting how illumination fell on objects in space. This shift toward naturalism did not mean a rejection of religious content. Most Renaissance art remained religious in subject matter, depicting scenes from the Bible, the lives of saints, or theological concepts. But these sacred subjects were now rendered in a new way, with convincing bodies occupying convincing spaces, the divine made manifest in forms that looked genuinely human. The Renaissance artists also developed a new understanding of their own role. In medieval Europe, artists were considered craftsmen, skilled workers who executed commissions according to established formulas. They worked in anonymous workshops, and their individual identities were often unrecorded. The Renaissance transformed artists into something approaching celebrities. Their names were known and celebrated. Their individual styles were recognized and prized. They were treated with respect by princes and popes, consulted on matters far beyond the technical execution of artworks. The concept of artistic genius, of the artist as a uniquely gifted individual whose creativity bordered on the divine, emerged during this period and has shaped our understanding of art ever since. Among the first heroes of the Renaissance artistic revolution was Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith and architect whose achievements still shape our world. Brunelleschi was born in Florence in 1377, and from early in his career, he displayed the combination of technical skill and creative vision that would characterize the Renaissance artist. Brunelleschi's most famous achievement was the dome of Florence's cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. The cathedral had been under construction for over a century when Brunelleschi took on the challenge of completing it. The problem was daunting. The original plans called for a dome of unprecedented size, so large that no one knew how to build it. The techniques that had been used for smaller domes could not be scaled up to the dimensions required. For years, the cathedral stood with a great open hole where the dome should be, a visible reminder of the limits of contemporary engineering. Various solutions were proposed, including filling the space beneath the dome with earth so that workers could build on a solid foundation. But Brunelleschi proposed something far more innovative. He would build the dome without any supporting framework at all. His solution involved a double shell construction, with an inner and outer dome connected by a system of ribs. As the dome rose, each ring of bricks was laid in a herringbone pattern that locked them into place, making the structure self-supporting even during construction. Brunelleschi designed custom machinery to lift materials to the working level, hundreds of feet above the ground. The project took 16 years to complete, from 1420 to 1436. When finished, the dome was the largest built since antiquity, larger than any dome constructed in the 1,000 years since the Pantheon in Rome. It remained the largest dome in the world for centuries and continues to dominate the Florence skyline today. Brunelleschi's achievement was not merely technical. The dome became a symbol of Florence itself, a demonstration that modern Florentines could rival and even exceed the achievements of the ancient Romans. It proved that problems which had seemed impossible could be solved through creativity, mathematics, and sheer determination. Brunelleschi also played a crucial role in developing linear perspective, the system of representing three-dimensional space that would revolutionize Renaissance painting. He conducted experiments demonstrating how parallel lines appear to converge at a single vanishing point, and how objects diminish in size according to their distance from the viewer. These principles, which seem obvious to us today, were revolutionary discoveries that gave artists new power to create convincing illusions of depth. While Brunelleschi transformed architecture, his friend Donato di Niccolò di Bettobardi, known as Donatello, revolutionized sculpture. Born around 1386, Donatello created works that brought back to life the naturalism and emotional power of ancient sculpture while addressing distinctly Renaissance themes. Donatello's early work already showed his revolutionary approach. His figure of Saint George, created around 1416 for a niche on the exterior of San Michele, broke with medieval conventions. The saint stands in a naturalistic pose, his weight distributed believably on his feet, his face alert and determined. The shallow relief panel beneath the figure demonstrates perspective in sculpture, creating an illusion of depth on a nearly flat surface. Over his long career, Donatello explored the full range of sculptural expression. His bronze David, created around the 1440s, was the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity. The figure of the young shepherd who slew Goliath stands in a graceful contrapposto pose, his body relaxed but subtly alive, his expression contemplative rather than triumphant. Donatello could also convey intense emotion. His wooden sculpture of Mary Magdalene, created late in his life, shows the penitent saint as an aged, emaciated figure, her body ravaged by years of fasting and self-denial in the desert. The work is almost painful to look at, so raw is its depiction of human suffering and spiritual intensity. The range of Donatello's achievement demonstrated what Renaissance sculpture could accomplish. He had shown that modern artists could work in bronze and marble with the skill of the ancients. He had revealed the expressive possibilities of the human body, and he had created works that would inspire generations of sculptors who followed, including the young Michelangelo. The revolution in painting found its first great master in Tommaso di Ser Giovanni di Simone, known as Masaccio, meaning clumsy or rough Tom. Despite his unflattering nickname and his short life, dying at about 2007, Masaccio created works that defined the direction of Renaissance painting for generations. Masaccio's frescoes in the Brancacci chapel of the Church of Santa Maria del Carmen in Florence, painted in the mid-1420s, demonstrated the full power of the new artistic approach. The most famous scene, the tribute money, depicts Christ and his apostles confronted by a tax collector. What strikes the viewer first is the convincing space in which the figures stand. The landscape recedes believably into the distance, with mountains fading into atmospheric haze. The figures cast shadows on the ground, grounding them firmly in the physical world. They stand in naturalistic poses, their weight distributed realistically, their garments falling according to the logic of gravity and the forms beneath. But Masaccio's achievement goes beyond technical virtuosity. The figures have an emotional presence, a psychological depth that was new in painting. Peter's face shows surprise and concern at the tax collector's demand. Christ points toward the sea with calm authority, directing Peter to find the coin that will pay the tax. The expressions and gestures convey the narrative with unprecedented clarity. The expulsion from the Garden of Eden, another scene in the Brancacci chapel, demonstrates Masaccio's power to move the viewer emotionally. Adam and Eve, driven from paradise by an angel with a sword, walk forward in poses of utter despair. Eve's face, contorted with grief, her mouth open in a howl of anguish, creates one of the most powerful images of human suffering in all of art. Masaccio died young, his promise unfulfilled, but his influence was enormous. Artists came from across Italy to study the Brancacci chapel frescoes. Michelangelo himself, growing up in Florence a generation later, made drawings after Masaccio's figures. The techniques Masaccio pioneered, perspective, anatomical accuracy, emotional expressiveness, became the foundation of Renaissance painting. Sandro Botticelli represents a different strand of Florentine Renaissance art, one more concerned with grace and beauty than with naturalistic representation, and deeply influenced by the philosophical interests of the Medici circle. Born Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippi around 1445, Botticelli trained in the workshop of Fra Filippo Lippi, one of the leading painters of the previous generation. He developed a distinctive style characterized by flowing lines, delicate colors, and an otherworldly beauty that set his work apart from the more robust naturalism of many contemporaries. Botticelli's most famous paintings, The Birth of Venus and Primavera, were created in the 1480s for members of the Medici family. These works drew on classical mythology, depicting ancient gods and goddesses in settings of extraordinary beauty. But they were not merely decorative illustrations of pagan myths. They were intended to convey philosophical ideas dear to the Medici circle. The philosophers gathered around Lorenzo de' Medici, particularly Marsilio Ficino, had developed a synthesis of Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. They believed that beauty in the physical world was a reflection of divine beauty, that the contemplation of earthly loveliness could lead the soul toward understanding of heavenly truth. The ancient myths, properly understood, contained wisdom that complemented rather than contradicted Christian teaching. Botticelli's mythological paintings embodied these ideas. The Birth of Venus depicts not merely the ancient goddess of love, but a symbol of beauty itself being born into the world. The figure rising from the sea echoes the pose of classical sculptures, linking the Renaissance present to the glories of antiquity. The delicate grace of the goddess, her expression at once sensual and spiritual, invites contemplation of beauty as a path to higher understanding. Primavera, the springtime painting, shows a gathering of mythological figures in a lush garden. Venus presides at the center, while the three Graces dance nearby, and Flora scatters flowers across the meadow. Mercury reaches up toward the clouds at the left, a gesture sometimes interpreted as representing the soul's ascent toward divine truth through the contemplation of beauty. These paintings represent Renaissance art at its most sophisticated, works that reward extended contemplation and multiple levels of interpretation. They are beautiful to look at, certainly, but they also embody complex philosophical ideas that engage the most cultivated minds of their time. Botticelli also created religious works of great power. His Madonnas show the Virgin and Child with a tenderness and beauty that made them immediately popular. His altarpieces demonstrate his ability to work within traditional religious formats while bringing his distinctive sense of grace and elegance. The later years of Botticelli's career were marked by the influence of Savonarola, the fiery preacher who briefly dominated Florence after the expulsion of the Medici in 1494. Botticelli, like many Florentines, seems to have been deeply affected by Savonarola's calls for moral reform and his condemnation of secular vanity. Some accounts say that Botticelli threw some of his own paintings into the bonfires of the vanities that Savonarola organized. Whether or not this is true, his later works show a more austere, almost harsh quality that suggests a crisis of artistic and spiritual confidence. The artistic achievements of Renaissance Florence were inseparable from the intellectual movement known as humanism. Humanists were scholars who devoted themselves to the studia humanitatis, the study of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, based primarily on ancient Greek and Roman texts. Humanism was not a philosophy in the strict sense. Humanists did not share a common doctrine or belief system. Some were devout Christians who saw classical learning as preparation for understanding Scripture. Others were more skeptical, questioning traditional religious beliefs in the light of ancient philosophy. What united them was a commitment to recovering, understanding, and learning from the literature of antiquity. The humanists developed new methods of textual analysis that would eventually transform scholarship. They learned to read texts historically, understanding them in the context of the societies that produced them, rather than as timeless authorities speaking directly to the present. They compared manuscripts to identify errors introduced by copyists. They detected forgeries, including famously the donation of Constantine, a document that had been used for centuries to justify papal territorial claims, but which Lorenzo Valla proved in 1440 to be a medieval fabrication. Beyond their scholarly achievements, the humanists promoted a new set of values. They believed in the dignity of the individual human being, created in God's image and capable of remarkable achievements. They emphasized the active life over the contemplative, arguing that educated people should use their learning in service to their communities. They valued eloquence, the ability to speak and write persuasively, as both a practical skill and a moral virtue. The humanist educational program spread rapidly through Italy and eventually to all of Europe. Young men from elite families were educated according to humanist principles, reading the classics and learning to compose elegant Latin prose. This shared education created a common culture among the ruling classes of different cities and nations, a republic of letters that transcended political boundaries. Women were largely excluded from this educational revolution, though some exceptions existed. A few women from wealthy families received humanist educations, and some of these became notable scholars and writers. But for the most part, the opportunities created by humanism were limited to men. The spread of Renaissance ideas was dramatically accelerated by one of the most important inventions in human history, the printing press with movable type. Developed by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany around 1450, the printing press reached Italy within 2 decades and quickly transformed the production and distribution of books. Before printing, books were copied by hand, a slow and expensive process. A single scribe might take months or even years to copy a lengthy work. Books were precious objects, owned only by churches, monasteries, universities, and wealthy individuals. A scholar might travel hundreds of miles to consult a particular manuscript held in a distant library. Printing changed everything. A skilled printer could produce hundreds of copies of a book in the time it would take a scribe to copy one. The cost of books dropped dramatically, making them accessible to a much wider audience. Ideas could spread with unprecedented speed, reaching readers across Europe within months of publication. Venice became the center of Italian printing. The city's position as a commercial hub, its relatively tolerant government, and its large population of skilled craftsmen made it ideal for the new industry. By 1500, Venice had more printing presses than any other city in Europe, and Venetian books were exported throughout the continent. The most famous Venetian printer was Aldus Manutius, who established his press in 1494. Aldus combined scholarly expertise with business acumen. He hired the best humanist scholars to edit the texts he published, ensuring that his editions were as accurate as possible. He developed a new typeface, italic, that allowed for more compact printing and gave his books a distinctive appearance. His editions of the Greek classics made texts available that had previously been accessible only in a handful of manuscripts. The printing press had consequences that extended far beyond the world of scholarship. Religious reformers would soon use printing to spread their ideas to mass audiences. Political pamphlets could now reach thousands of readers. Scientific findings could be quickly communicated across Europe, accelerating the pace of discovery. The printed book became the primary medium for preserving and transmitting knowledge, a role it would hold until the development of electronic media. 500 years later, while Florence dominated the artistic life of the early Renaissance, it was not alone. Other Italian cities developed their own distinctive contributions to Renaissance culture, often in competition with Florence and with each other. Milan, under the rule of the Visconti, and later the Sforza families, cultivated a more courtly Renaissance culture. The Dukes of Milan spent lavishly on castles, churches, and works of art, seeking to demonstrate their magnificence and legitimate their rule. Leonardo da Vinci would spend many years in Milan, working for Duke Ludovico Sforza on projects ranging from paintings to military engineering. Venice, the wealthy republic at the head of the Adriatic, developed an artistic tradition distinct from that of Florence. Venetian painters were particularly renowned for their use of color, developing rich, glowing palettes that contrasted with the more linear, drawing-based approach of Florentine art. Giovanni Bellini, the leading Venetian painter of the late 15th century, created religious images of extraordinary serenity and beauty that would influence generations of successors. Rome, though politically turbulent and economically depressed for much of the 15th century, began to emerge as a major center of Renaissance culture. As the century drew to a close, a series of ambitious popes undertook to transform Rome from a decrepit medieval city into a capital worthy of the ancient Caesars and of the Universal Church. This transformation would accelerate dramatically in the 16th century, making Rome the center of the High Renaissance. Smaller courts throughout Italy also contributed to Renaissance culture. Mantua, under the Gonzaga family, became a notable center of art and learning. Federico da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, assembled one of the finest libraries in Europe and made his small state a haven for humanists and artists. Ferrara, ruled by the Este family, was particularly known for its literary culture and its tradition of chivalric poetry. This multiplicity of centers gave the Italian Renaissance its extraordinary vitality. Artists and scholars could move from court to court and city to city, seeking the most favorable conditions for their work. Competition among patrons drove up both the quality and quantity of artistic production. And the absence of a single dominant political power meant that no one style or approach could monopolize cultural authority. As we allow ourselves to settle more deeply into relaxation, let us consider one of the most distinctive ideas to emerge from the Renaissance: the belief in human dignity and potential. Medieval thought had emphasized human sinfulness and weakness. Born into original sin, human beings were dependent on divine grace for salvation. The proper attitude of the Christian was humility before God, recognition of one's own unworthiness, and hope for redemption through faith. Renaissance humanists, without necessarily rejecting Christian doctrine, developed a more positive view of human nature. They pointed to the remarkable achievements of human civilization, from ancient times to their own day, as evidence of human capability. They celebrated the human mind's power to understand the universe, the human hand's ability to create works of beauty, the human will's capacity to shape history. The most eloquent expression of this new vision came from Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a brilliant young nobleman who gathered all the learning of his age and attempted to synthesize it into a unified philosophy. In 1486, at the age of 23, Pico proposed to debate 900 Thuses in Rome, arguing that all philosophies and religions contained elements of truth that could be harmonized. Pico's oration on the dignity of man, intended as the opening speech for this debate, became one of the most famous texts of the Renaissance. In it, Pico imagined God addressing the newly created Adam, explaining humanity's unique place in the universe. Unlike other creatures, God told Adam, human beings were not assigned a fixed nature. They were not rooted in one place or limited to one mode of existence. Instead, they had the freedom to determine their own nature, to make themselves into whatever they chose. They could sink to the level of beasts if they devoted themselves to bodily pleasures. Or they could rise to the level of angels if they devoted themselves to contemplation. The choice was theirs. This idea of human self-determination marked a significant shift from medieval thought. It suggested that human beings were not merely passive recipients of divine grace, but active shapers of their own destinies. It opened the possibility that individuals could improve themselves through education and effort, that human nature itself was not fixed but malleable. Pico's vision was perhaps too optimistic. His debate in Rome was never held. The Pope condemned some of his Thuses as heretical, and Pico spent years fleeing from church authorities. He died young, at 31, under circumstances that suggested poisoning. The dream of harmonizing all philosophies remained unfulfilled, but the ideas Pico expressed continued to resonate. They expressed something essential about the Renaissance spirit, the belief that human beings were capable of greatness, that the achievements of the present could equal or surpass those of antiquity, that individual effort and cultivation could transform both the self and the world. Let us pause here for a moment. Allow your breathing to become even slower, even more relaxed. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. Let your mind drift gently, carrying images of Renaissance Florence. The great dome rising above the city, the flowing lines of Botticelli's figures, the gathered scholars debating in lantern-lit rooms. The Renaissance was built by human beings who, like us, lived ordinary lives filled with work and worry, with hope and disappointment. They ate meals and slept at night. They loved their families and worried about money. They fell ill and recovered, or did not recover. In the midst of these everyday experiences, they created a transformation of culture that still shapes our world. As you rest now, consider that you too are connected to this great human story. The ideas born in Renaissance Italy flow through our language, our art, our understanding of what it means to be human. The questions the humanists asked about education, about civic duty, about the good life are questions we still ask today. Rest now, and when you are ready, we will continue our journey into the 15th century, following the spread of Renaissance ideas and the emergence of even greater artistic achievements. There is no hurry. The story will continue to unfold at whatever pace brings you peace. As the 15th century began, Italy found itself at the center of one of the great crises of medieval Christendom, the Great Western Schism. Since 1378, the Catholic Church had been divided between rival popes, one based in Rome and another in Avignon, France. Each pope claimed to be the legitimate successor of Saint Peter, and each condemned the other as an impostor. This division had profound consequences for Italy. The Papal States, the band of territory across central Italy that the popes claimed to rule, became a battleground for competing factions. Rome itself fell into decay as rival claimants fought for control. The moral authority of the papacy, already shaken by other scandals, suffered enormously from the spectacle of Christians divided over who was their true spiritual leader. The resolution of the schism came through a series of church councils, gatherings of bishops and other church leaders who claimed authority to reform the church and resolve its divisions. The Council of Constance, meeting from 1414 to 1418, finally succeeded in ending the schism by deposing the rival popes and electing a single successor, Martin V. Martin V, a member of the Roman Colonna family, set about restoring papal authority and rebuilding Rome. When he entered the city in 1420, he found it in ruins. The population had dropped to perhaps 25,000, a fraction of its ancient glory. Buildings had collapsed, streets were impassable, wolves roamed the outskirts. The new pope began the long process of restoration that would eventually transform Rome into the magnificent capital of the Renaissance papacy. But the conciliar movement that had ended the schism also posed a continuing challenge to papal authority. If a council could depose popes, did that not imply that councils were superior to popes? The popes of the 15th century spent considerable energy resisting this conclusion, reasserting their authority over the church and ultimately defeating the conciliar movement. The political fragmentation of Italy meant almost constant warfare among the various states. But warfare in 15th century Italy had its own distinctive character, shaped by the institution of the condottiero, the mercenary captain who fought for pay rather than loyalty. The condottieri emerged in the 14th century as Italian cities discovered that hiring professional soldiers was more practical than relying on citizen militias. A prosperous merchant or banker had little desire to risk his life on the battlefield when he could hire someone else to fight for him. And the specialized skills of warfare, particularly mounted combat, required years of training that most citizens could not spare. The condottieri built military companies that they rented to whatever city or prince would pay them. Some were Italian, others came from Germany, Spain, or elsewhere in Europe. They moved from employer to employer, sometimes fighting for one city one year and its enemy the next. Their loyalty was to their paycheck, not to any cause or community. This mercenary system had significant consequences for Italian warfare. The condottieri had little interest in fighting to the death or in destroying property that might generate future employment. Battles were often more like elaborate chess games than bloody struggles, with commanders maneuvering for advantage and accepting defeat when the tactical situation became unfavorable. Sieges were common, but sacks were relatively rare. Later observers, including Machiavelli, would condemn the condottieri system as a source of Italian weakness. When French and Spanish armies invaded Italy at the end of the 15th century, fighting with a ferocity that the condottieri could not match, Italy would be unable to resist. But for most of the 15th century, the mercenary system maintained a balance of power among the Italian states that allowed the Renaissance to flourish. Some condottieri became significant figures in their own right. Francesco Sforza began his career as a mercenary captain and ended it as Duke of Milan, having married the illegitimate daughter of the last Visconti Duke and seized power after his father-in-law's death. Federigo da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, was one of the most successful and respected condottieri of his time, known for never breaking a contract and for fighting only for causes he considered just. The constant warfare among Italian states reached a turning point in 1454 with the Peace of Lodi. This treaty, negotiated primarily between Milan and Venice, established a general peace that would last, with some interruptions, for 40 years. The Peace of Lodi created what came to be called the Italian League, a system of alliances designed to maintain the balance of power among the 5 major Italian states: Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples. When any one state threatened to become too powerful, the others would unite against it, preventing any single power from dominating the peninsula. This system was far from perfect. Wars continued to break out, and the balance of power required constant adjustment. But the relative stability of the later 15th century allowed trade to flourish, cities to prosper, and culture to develop. The great achievements of the High Renaissance, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, were built on the foundation of this period of relative peace. Lorenzo de' Medici, in particular, made the maintenance of the Italian balance of power central to his diplomacy. He recognized that Florence, lacking the military resources of Milan or Venice, could only thrive in a peaceful Italy. He cultivated relationships with rulers across the peninsula, using his personal charm and diplomatic skill to diffuse conflicts before they erupted into war. When the Italian system finally collapsed, with the French invasion of 1494, Lorenzo had been dead for 2 years. Many contemporaries believed that if he had lived, he would have found some way to prevent the catastrophe. Whether this was true or merely nostalgia, it testified to the reputation Lorenzo had earned as the keeper of Italian peace. While Florence dominated the artistic life of the early Renaissance, Venice developed its own distinctive culture that would make it one of the great centers of Renaissance civilization. The Serenissima, as the Venetians called their republic, was unlike any other city in Italy or indeed in Europe. Venice was built on water. The city occupied over 100 small islands in a lagoon at the head of the Adriatic Sea, connected by bridges and canals. This unique situation had profound consequences for Venetian life and culture. The lagoon provided protection. Venice had no walls because it needed none. Any army attempting to attack the city would have to cross miles of shallow water, vulnerable to Venetian ships. This security gave Venice a stability that few other Italian cities enjoyed. While other states suffered invasions and revolutions, Venice remained independent, governed by the same political institutions for century after century. The sea also made Venice rich. Venetian merchants dominated the trade of the Eastern Mediterranean, importing spices, silks, and other luxury goods from Asia, and distributing them throughout Europe. The arsenal, the great naval shipyard of Venice, was the largest industrial enterprise in Europe, capable of producing a new galley in a single day using assembly line techniques that anticipated modern manufacturing. The government of Venice was an aristocratic republic, ruled by a small class of noble families whose names were inscribed in the Golden Book. The head of state was the Doge, elected for life by the nobility, but real power lay with various councils that checked and balanced each other in an elaborate constitutional system. This system proved remarkably stable. Venice avoided the factional conflicts that disrupted other Italian cities. It experienced no successful revolutions, no seizures of power by military strongmen. Foreign observers marveled at the harmony and order of Venetian political life, often attributing it to the wisdom of Venetian institutions. Venetian culture reflected this distinctive situation. Venetian painting, which would reach its greatest heights in the 16th century, with Titian and his successors, differed from Florentine painting in its emphasis on color over line, on atmospheric effects over precise drawing. The light of the lagoon, reflected off water and filtered through mist, found its way into Venetian art. Venetian architecture created a unique cityscape. The great palaces along the Grand Canal displayed facades of colored marble, Gothic arches giving way gradually to Renaissance classical forms. The Piazza San Marco, the great square at the heart of the city, gathered together the Basilica of San Marco with its Byzantine domes, the Doge's Palace with its delicate Gothic tracery, and the tall campanile that served as a landmark for ships approaching the city. Venice was also a center of printing, music, and learning. The University of Padua, part of Venetian territory, was one of the leading centers of scientific study in Europe, known particularly for its medical school. Venetian composers developed new forms of choral music that would influence the development of Western music for centuries. The Kingdom of Naples, occupying the southern third of the Italian peninsula, plus the island of Sicily, represented a different face of Renaissance Italy. This was not a land of city-states and merchant republics, but a feudal monarchy, ruled by kings and dominated by a landed aristocracy. The kingdom had a turbulent history. In the 13th century, the French House of Anjou had conquered it from the German Hohenstaufen dynasty. Sicily had rebelled in 1282, in an uprising known as the Sicilian Vespers, and passed to the Spanish House of Aragon. The mainland remained under Angevin rule, though contested by Aragonese claimants. In 1442, Alfonso V of Aragon finally conquered Naples, uniting the kingdom with Sicily under Spanish rule. Alfonso made Naples his capital, spending lavishly to transform it into a center of Renaissance culture. He gathered humanists at his court, founded a library, and patronized artists and architects. Naples under Alfonso and his successors developed a distinctive court culture. Unlike the Republican cities of the north, where wealthy merchants patronized the arts, Naples had a single dominant patron, the king. This concentrated cultural life around the court, giving it a more hierarchical and ceremonial character. The southern kingdom also faced different economic and social conditions. The great estates of the feudal nobility dominated the countryside, worked by peasants who had few of the freedoms enjoyed by city dwellers in the north. Commerce and industry were less developed. The gap between the wealthy nobility and the impoverished peasantry was wider and more rigid than in the urbanized north. Yet Naples was also a great city, one of the largest in Europe. Its harbor was busy with ships from across the Mediterranean. Its streets were filled with a diverse population including Greeks, Jews, and Muslims, as well as Italians. It was a city of sharp contrasts between splendor and poverty, between the sophisticated culture of the court and the raw vitality of the popular quarters. Milan, the great city of the Lombard Plain, represented yet another pattern of Renaissance development. Here, powerful ducal families created a court culture that rivaled those of kings. The Visconti family had ruled Milan since the 14th century, gradually expanding their territory until they controlled much of northern Italy. They were ambitious and often ruthless, using assassination and treachery as readily as diplomacy and war. But they were also patrons of culture, building great churches and castles, and attracting scholars and artists to their court. When the Visconti male line died out in 1447, Milan briefly experimented with republican government. But within 3 years, Francesco Sforza, the great condottiero, who had married the last Visconti duke's illegitimate daughter, seized power and established a new dynasty. The Sforza continued and expanded Visconti patronage. Ludovico Sforza, who ruled Milan from 1481 to 1499, made his court one of the most brilliant in Europe. He attracted artists and scholars from across Italy, including most famously Leonardo da Vinci, who spent nearly 2 decades in Milan, working on projects ranging from the Last Supper to military engineering. The Sforza court at Milan represented the Renaissance ideal of the prince as patron of culture. Ludovico saw artistic and intellectual achievement as an extension of political power, a way of demonstrating magnificence and attracting favorable attention. The artists and scholars who gathered at his court were not merely employees, but important contributors to the prestige of his rule. Allow yourself to sink deeper into relaxation now, as we explore the intellectual life of Renaissance Florence. Let your breathing become even slower and more regular. The ideas we will discuss may seem abstract, but they were passionately debated by real people who believed that right thinking was essential to right living. At the heart of Florentine intellectual life, in the late 15th century, was the Platonic Academy, a circle of philosophers gathered under the patronage of the Medici. This was not a formal institution with buildings and degrees, but rather a community of thinkers who met regularly to discuss ideas, exchange letters, and pursue wisdom together. The central figure of the Platonic Academy was Marsilio Ficino. Born in 1433, the son of Cosimo de' Medici's personal physician, Ficino devoted his life to the study and translation of Plato and the Platonic tradition. Cosimo recognized his abilities early and set him up with a villa and income specifically, so that he could pursue his philosophical work. Ficino translated the complete dialogues of Plato into Latin, making them accessible to Western readers for the first time since antiquity. He also translated the writings of Plotinus and other Neoplatonic philosophers, as well as the Hermetic texts, a body of mystical writings attributed to the ancient Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus. From these sources, Ficino developed a philosophical system that attempted to reconcile Platonic thought with Christian theology. He argued that Plato had glimpsed truths later, revealed more fully in Christianity. The Platonic ideas, the eternal forms that Plato believed underlay the changing world of appearances, were thoughts in the mind of God. The Platonic conception of the soul's ascent from the material world to contemplation of the good corresponded to the Christian understanding of salvation. Ficino's philosophy placed love at the center of the universe. Divine love had created the world and continued to sustain it. Human love, when properly directed, was a reflection of divine love and a means of ascending toward God. Beauty in the physical world was a manifestation of divine beauty, and the appreciation of beauty was a form of worship. This philosophy had profound implications for Renaissance art. If beauty was a reflection of the divine, then the creation and appreciation of beautiful things was a spiritual activity. Artists were not merely craftsmen producing decorative objects, but collaborators in the work of creation, making visible the invisible forms that constituted ultimate reality. The Platonic Academy included many of the most brilliant minds of Renaissance Florence. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, whose oration on the dignity of man we discussed earlier, was a younger member of the circle. Angelo Poliziano, the greatest Latin poet of his generation, participated in the discussions. Even Lorenzo de Medici himself, though occupied with politics and business, found time to engage with philosophical questions and to compose poetry influenced by Platonic ideas. The humanists' reverence for antiquity created intellectual as well as practical challenges. If the ancients had achieved so much, what was left for moderns to accomplish? Were they simply trying to recover what had been lost, or could they hope to equal or surpass ancient achievements? These questions were debated throughout the Renaissance. Some humanists took a purely retrospective view, seeing their task as the recovery and preservation of ancient wisdom. The best modern Latin, on this view, was that which most closely imitated Cicero. The best modern philosophy was that which most accurately interpreted Plato and Aristotle. Others took a more dynamic view. They argued that moderns could build on ancient foundations to create something new. The ancients had made great discoveries, but they had not discovered everything. Each generation could add to the sum of human knowledge, standing on the shoulders of giants to see farther than the giants themselves had seen. This debate would continue for centuries, reaching its fullest expression in the 17th century quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. But even in the Renaissance, there were signs that the moderns were surpassing their ancient teachers. The compass and printing press gave Europeans powers that the ancients had lacked. The voyages of exploration were revealing new worlds that the ancients had never imagined. And the artists of the Renaissance, while drawing deeply on ancient models, were creating works that many believed equaled or exceeded anything that antiquity had produced. The intellectual life of the Renaissance was transformed by the recovery of Greek learning. Throughout the Middle Ages, Western scholars had known Greek philosophy primarily through Latin translations, often made from Arabic versions that were themselves translations of lost Greek originals. Direct knowledge of Greek had become rare in Western Europe. The renewed study of Greek began in Italy in the late 14th century, largely through contact with Byzantine scholars. Manuel Chrysoloras, a Byzantine diplomat and scholar, taught Greek in Florence from 1397 to 1400, training a generation of Italian humanists in the language. His students went on to translate major Greek works into Latin, making them available to readers throughout Europe. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated this process. Byzantine scholars fleeing the Turkish conquest brought manuscripts with them, including texts unknown or long lost in the West. The philosopher George Gemistos Plethon, who had visited Florence in 1439, had sparked Cosimo de Medici's interest in Plato, leading directly to the establishment of the Platonic Academy. Among the most important Greek texts to be recovered was the full corpus of Aristotle's works. Medieval scholars had known Aristotle primarily through his logical writings, and from the 12th century onward, through translations of his scientific and philosophical works from Arabic. Now the Greek originals became available, along with ancient commentaries that cast new light on Aristotle's meaning. The recovery of ancient Greek medicine, mathematics, and science would eventually prove even more significant than the recovery of philosophy. The works of Euclid, Archimedes, and Ptolemy, studied in their original Greek, provided the foundation for the scientific revolution that would transform European thought in the 16th and 17th centuries. As we continue to explore the Renaissance, let us consider how art was actually made in this period. The romantic image of the solitary genius working alone in inspired frenzy bears little relation to the reality of Renaissance artistic production. Art in Renaissance Italy was made in workshops. A master artist would employ apprentices and assistants who helped with every stage of the creative process, from grinding pigments to painting backgrounds to executing designs that the master had sketched. A major commission might involve dozens of hands, all working under the direction of the master, whose name the finished work would bear. A young man aspiring to become an artist would enter a workshop as an apprentice, often at the age of 12 or 13. For years, he would learn the basics of his craft: how to prepare panels and canvases, how to mix colors, how to handle brushes and tools. Gradually, he would be entrusted with more significant tasks, painting less important parts of compositions, and eventually creating works of his own under the master's supervision. When his training was complete, an apprentice could join the painter's guild, which regulated the practice of the profession. He might remain in his master's workshop as a journeyman, or he might set out on his own, establishing a workshop where he would train the next generation of apprentices. This system meant that artistic knowledge was passed down directly from master to student, preserved in the hands and eyes of practitioners rather than in books. Techniques were often closely guarded secrets, shared only within the workshop. A master's style would be perpetuated through his students, creating artistic lineages that could be traced across generations. The workshop system also shaped the nature of artistic production. Most art was made on commission, produced to order for specific patrons who specified what they wanted. A contract might detail not only the subject of a painting but its size, the colors to be used, the amount of gold leaf, and the time allowed for completion. The artist was expected to satisfy the patron's requirements, not simply to express his own vision. Yet within these constraints, there was room for individual creativity. A skilled artist could negotiate with patrons, suggesting alternatives and demonstrating his superior judgment. The most successful artists built reputations that allowed them to command higher prices and greater artistic freedom. And the culture of competition among artists drove innovation, as each sought to outdo his rivals in skill and invention. Renaissance painters worked in a variety of techniques, each suited to particular purposes. The two most important were fresco and panel painting. Fresco, meaning fresh in Italian, was the technique of painting on wet plaster. The painter would apply a layer of plaster to a wall, then paint on it while it was still damp. As the plaster dried, the pigments bonded chemically with it, creating an extremely durable surface. Properly executed, frescoes could last for centuries. Fresco required careful planning. Because the paint had to be applied while the plaster was wet, the artist could only work on a small area at a time, typically what could be completed in a single day. The design had to be transferred to the wall in advance, either by drawing directly on an underlying layer of plaster, or by using a cartoon, a full-scale drawing that was traced, or poked with holes through which charcoal dust was pushed. The technique was demanding but rewarding. Frescoes could cover vast surfaces, creating environments that surrounded and enveloped the viewer. The public nature of fresco meant that it was particularly suited to civic and religious spaces where large audiences would encounter the images. The great fresco cycles of the Renaissance, from Masaccio's Brancacci Chapel to Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, demonstrated what the technique could achieve. Panel painting used different methods. The artist painted on wooden panels that had been prepared with layers of gesso, a white ground that provided a smooth surface. The paint was typically tempera, pigments mixed with egg yolk, though oil painting was increasingly used as the 15th century progressed. Panel painting allowed for greater detail and precision than fresco. The artist could work slowly, building up layers of color and making changes as needed. The resulting works were portable, able to be moved from place to place, bought and sold on the art market. Panel paintings were typically smaller than frescoes, suited to private devotion rather than public display. Renaissance art communicated through a visual language that contemporary viewers understood, but that modern viewers often need to learn. Objects, colors, gestures, and arrangements all carried meanings that enriched the significance of the images. Religious paintings were particularly rich in symbolism. A lily might represent the Virgin Mary's purity. A lamb symbolized Christ as the sacrifice for human sin. A skull reminded viewers of mortality. A peacock suggested resurrection, as its flesh was believed not to decay after death. Colors too had meanings. Blue was associated with heaven and the Virgin Mary. Red suggested passion, whether sacred or profane. Gold indicated divinity, the presence of the transcendent in the mundane world. White represented purity, black mortality or mourning. Gestures followed conventions that viewers would recognize. A raised hand might indicate blessing or teaching. Hands clasped in prayer showed devotion. Fingers pointing directed attention to significant elements of the composition. Even the direction of a gaze could communicate, linking figures in networks of visual relationship. The arrangement of figures in space also conveyed meaning. More important figures were typically larger and placed in more prominent positions. Symmetry suggested order and harmony. Hierarchy was established through placement, with higher positions indicating greater status or sanctity. Understanding this visual language allows us to read Renaissance paintings as their original audiences would have read them. What might seem to a modern viewer like arbitrary details reveal themselves as meaningful elements of a carefully constructed message. The Renaissance artist was not simply depicting a scene, but teaching, exhorting, and moving viewers through a sophisticated system of visual rhetoric. As we bring this first part of our journey to a close, let us rest with what we have learned. We have traced the origins of the Italian Renaissance, from the commercial wealth of the medieval city-states to the cultural ambitions of the Medici family. We have met the artists who transformed the visual world, from Brunelleschi's dome to Botticelli's flowing figures. We have explored the intellectual currents that shaped Renaissance thought, from humanist scholarship to Platonic philosophy. The Renaissance was a time of extraordinary creativity and change. In the space of a few generations, Italians developed new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking, new ways of understanding what it meant to be human. The achievements of this period continue to shape our world today, from the art that fills our museums to the ideas that inform our education. But our journey has only begun. In the parts that follow, we will explore the High Renaissance, when artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo pushed the limits of human achievement. We will examine the spread of Renaissance ideas across Europe and their transformation in new contexts. We will consider the religious and political upheavals that eventually brought the Renaissance to an end. For now, rest peacefully. Let the images and ideas we have explored drift through your mind like clouds across a sky. The dome of Florence rises above the city, catching the light of the setting sun. The philosophers gather in their candle-lit rooms, debating the nature of beauty and truth. The artists mix their pigments and prepare their panels, ready to create works that will endure for centuries. This is the world of the Renaissance, and it is yours to explore. Sleep now, and when you are ready, we will continue our journey together. Welcome back to our journey through Renaissance Italy. As you settle into a comfortable position, let your breathing become slow and natural. Allow the tension to drain from your body, and let your mind become receptive to the stories and ideas that await. In the first part of our exploration, we traced the origins of the Renaissance in the fertile soil of medieval Italy. We watched Florence become the cradle of a new age, and we met the artists and thinkers who began the transformation of European culture. Now we move into the period known as the High Renaissance, roughly the years from 1490 to 1527, when Italian art and culture reached what many consider their greatest heights. These were years of extraordinary achievement and profound change. Leonardo da Vinci created paintings that still astonish the world. Michelangelo carved figures of superhuman power and painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael achieved a perfection of grace and harmony that came to define the classical ideal. At the same time, political and religious forces were gathering that would eventually transform Italy and all of Europe. Let the gentle rhythm of this narrative carry you toward peaceful rest. The stories we will explore are stories of human excellence, of beauty created in turbulent times, of genius flourishing amidst war and upheaval. They remind us that even in the most difficult circumstances, human beings can reach for greatness, and sometimes achieve it. No figure embodies the Renaissance ideal of the universal man more completely than Leonardo da Vinci. Painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, scientist, anatomist, writer, Leonardo pursued knowledge in every field with an insatiable curiosity that still awes us today. Leonardo was born in 1452 in the small town of Vinci, in the hills between Florence and Pisa. He was the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman, a status that would have significant consequences for his life. As an illegitimate child, Leonardo could not inherit his father's profession or attend university. But his evident abilities led his father to apprentice him to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the leading artists of Florence. In Verrocchio's workshop, Leonardo received a comprehensive education in the visual arts. He learned painting, sculpture, and metalwork. He studied anatomy by dissecting corpses and drawing what he observed. He developed the powers of observation that would characterize his entire career, seeing with an intensity that revealed the world in all its complexity. A famous story, probably apocryphal but revealing nonetheless, tells of Leonardo's contribution to a painting of the baptism of Christ that Verrocchio was creating. According to this story, Leonardo painted one of the angels in the scene so beautifully that Verrocchio, recognizing his pupil's superior talent, vowed never to paint again. Whether or not this literally happened, it captures something essential about Leonardo. From an early age, he was recognized as extraordinary. Leonardo remained in Florence until 1482, when he moved to Milan to work for Duke Lodovico Sforza. In his letter applying for employment, Leonardo listed his abilities as a military engineer before mentioning his skills as an artist. He could design bridges, tunnels, and fortifications. He could create war machines and divert rivers. He could also, he mentioned almost as an afterthought, create paintings and sculptures that would bring glory to his patron. In Milan, Leonardo flourished. He painted the Virgin of the Rocks and the Lady with an Ermine. He created a massive clay model for an equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza that was never cast in bronze. He designed costumes and sets for court entertainments. He began the notebooks in which he recorded his observations and ideas, thousands of pages covered with drawings and mirror-written text. Leonardo's most famous work from his Milan period is The Last Supper, painted on the wall of the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie. This depiction of Christ's final meal with his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion became one of the most celebrated images in the history of art. The painting captures the moment just after Christ has announced that one of his disciples will betray him. The 12 apostles react with shock, dismay, and denial. Leonardo shows each figure responding according to his individual character, creating a drama of gesture and expression that draws the viewer into the emotional intensity of the scene. The composition is a masterpiece of design. Christ sits at the center, framed by a window behind him that creates a halo of light around his head. The apostles are arranged in 4 groups of 3, their movements creating waves of agitation that spread outward from the central calm of Christ's figure. The lines of the ceiling and walls converge on Christ's head, using perspective to reinforce the composition's focus. Leonardo's technique in The Last Supper was innovative but ultimately problematic. Rather than using the traditional fresco method, which would have required him to work quickly on wet plaster, Leonardo experimented with a combination of oil and tempera that allowed him to work more slowly and make revisions. But this experimental technique did not bond properly with the wall, and the painting began to deteriorate almost immediately. Even in its damaged state, The Last Supper remains one of the most moving images ever created. The composition has been copied countless times, becoming so familiar that it can be difficult to see it with fresh eyes. But if we look carefully, we can still feel the shock of that moment of revelation, still see the range of human response to betrayal and loss that Leonardo captured with such insight. Leonardo's notebooks reveal the extraordinary range of his interests. He studied anatomy through direct observation, dissecting more than 30 human corpses over the course of his lifetime. His anatomical drawings are marvels of precision and clarity, showing the structure of muscles, bones, and organs with an accuracy that was not surpassed for centuries. He studied the flight of birds, hoping to understand the principles that might allow human beings to fly. His notebooks contain designs for flying machines, from ornithopters that would flap like birds to devices resembling modern helicopters. None of these could have worked with the materials and power sources available in his time, but they demonstrate his systematic approach to engineering problems. He designed weapons of war, from improved cannons to tanks to giant crossbows. He planned canals and harbors. He studied the flow of water, creating drawings that captured the complex patterns of currents and eddies. He investigated optics, geology, and botany. There seemed to be no limit to his curiosity or to his confidence that systematic observation could reveal nature's secrets. What distinguished Leonardo's scientific work was his reliance on direct observation and experiment. He did not simply accept the authority of ancient texts, but sought to verify claims through his own investigation. He believed that the eye was the most reliable instrument for understanding the world, and he trained his eye to see with extraordinary acuity. Yet Leonardo's scientific work remained largely unknown during his lifetime and for centuries afterward. He never published his findings. His notebooks, written in his characteristic mirror script, were scattered after his death and only gradually reassembled. The knowledge he accumulated died with him, and many of his discoveries had to be made again by later scientists who knew nothing of his work. Leonardo left Milan in 1499, when French forces invaded and overthrew Ludovico Sforza. He spent the next years in various cities, including Florence, Venice, and Rome, before returning to Milan and eventually moving to France, where he spent his final years as a guest of King Francis I. During his second Florentine period, Leonardo began the painting now known as the Mona Lisa. This portrait of a Florentine woman, probably Lisa Gherardini, wife of a merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, has become the most famous painting in the world. The Mona Lisa seems at first glance a simple portrait, a woman seated before a landscape, her hands folded, her expression calm. But the painting rewards extended contemplation. The sfumato technique, the subtle gradations of light and shadow that Leonardo perfected, gives the figure an almost living presence. The landscape behind her, with its winding rivers and distant mountains, creates a sense of vast space and geological time that contrasts with the intimate human presence in the foreground. And then there is the smile, that famous smile that has generated endless speculation and interpretation. Is she smiling or not? Is her expression happy, melancholy, knowing, mysterious? The ambiguity seems intentional, an invitation to see in the image whatever we bring to it. Leonardo has created not merely a likeness but a presence, a figure who seems to think and feel, whose inner life remains forever inaccessible yet somehow present. Leonardo worked on the Mona Lisa for years, carrying it with him as he moved from city to city, making changes and refinements. He never delivered it to the patron who had commissioned it, keeping it with him until his death. When he died in France in 1519, the painting remained in the French royal collection. It now hangs in the Louvre, protected by bulletproof glass and visited by millions of tourists each year. If Leonardo embodied the Renaissance ideal of universal genius, Michelangelo Buonarroti embodied the ideal of the artist as creator, a figure whose works seemed to approach the divine. His contemporaries called him Il Divino, the Divine One, and his achievements in sculpture, painting, and architecture justify the title. Michelangelo was born in 1475 in Capri, a small town where his father was serving a temporary appointment as a local official. The family returned to Florence when Michelangelo was young, and he grew up in that city that had nurtured so much artistic genius. As a boy, Michelangelo showed unmistakable talent for drawing and painting. His father, who considered art a humble profession beneath the family's dignity, objected to his son's ambitions. But the boy's determination and ability eventually won out, and at the age of 13, he was apprenticed to the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. Michelangelo's stay in Ghirlandaio's workshop was brief. Within a year, he had moved to the sculpture garden of San Marco, a kind of informal academy sponsored by Lorenzo de' Medici, where promising young artists could study ancient sculptures. Here Michelangelo found his true calling. Sculpture, he believed, was the highest of the arts, the one most closely connected to the divine act of creation. Lorenzo de' Medici recognized Michelangelo's abilities and brought him into the Medici household. For several years, the young artist lived as virtually a member of the family, dining at Lorenzo's table and participating in the intellectual life of the court. He met the philosophers, poets, and scholars who gathered around the magnificent, absorbing the ideas that would inform his art throughout his life. When Lorenzo died in 1492, and his son Piero was driven from Florence 2 years later, Michelangelo left the city as well. He traveled first to Bologna and then to Rome, where he would create some of his most celebrated works. In Rome, Michelangelo carved the Pietà, completed in 1499. This depiction of the Virgin Mary, holding the dead body of Christ, represents one of the supreme achievements of Renaissance sculpture. The figures are carved from a single block of marble, their forms emerging from the stone with extraordinary grace and power. The Virgin is shown as a young woman, her face serene despite her grief. Her massive robes provide a base from which Christ's body extends, his form limp and heavy with death. The anatomy of Christ's body is rendered with perfect accuracy, every muscle and tendon visible beneath the skin. Yet the overall impression is not of clinical precision but of profound emotion, a mother's grief made eternal in stone. Returning to Florence, Michelangelo took on an even greater challenge, a massive block of marble that had been begun and abandoned by an earlier sculptor. From this damaged stone, Michelangelo carved the David, the colossal figure that would become a symbol of Florence itself. The David depicts the biblical hero in the moment before his battle with Goliath. Unlike earlier representations that showed David after his victory, standing triumphant over the giant's severed head, Michelangelo shows the shepherd boy in a moment of tension and anticipation. His body is relaxed but alert, his eyes focused on an enemy we cannot see, his right hand holding the sling that will bring down the giant. The figure stands over 14 feet tall, a superhuman presence that dominates any space it occupies. The proportions are subtly distorted to enhance the sense of power. The hands and head are slightly oversized, compensating for the angle from which the statue was originally intended to be viewed, high on the exterior of Florence Cathedral. In 1504, the David was unveiled in the Piazza della Signoria, the central square of Florence, where it would stand for over 300 years before being moved to the Accademia Gallery. Its placement in the political heart of the city was significant. The David became a symbol of Florentine liberty, the small republic standing ready to defend itself against far larger enemies. In 1508, Michelangelo was called back to Rome by Pope Julius II, the most ambitious and aggressive of the Renaissance popes. Julius had grand plans for rebuilding Rome, including a new St. Peter's Basilica that would be the largest church in Christendom. He also had a commission for Michelangelo, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel was, and remains, the private chapel of the popes, the site where the cardinals gathered to elect each new pope. Its walls had been decorated in the 1480s, with frescoes by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and other leading painters. But the ceiling remained a simple blue field, dotted with gold stars. Michelangelo initially resisted the commission. He considered himself a sculptor, not a painter, and he suspected that his enemies at the papal court had suggested the ceiling project to set him up for failure. But Julius would not take no for an answer, and Michelangelo eventually agreed. The project consumed 4 years of Michelangelo's life, from 1508 to 1512. He worked largely alone, lying on his back on a scaffold high above the chapel floor, paint dripping into his face. The physical strain was enormous, and Michelangelo's health suffered. In a poem written during this period, he complained of his neck bent back, his beard pointed toward heaven, his brush making a rich pavement of his face. What emerged from this labor was one of the supreme achievements of Western art. The ceiling depicts scenes from the book of Genesis, from the creation of the world to the story of Noah. At the center are 9 narrative panels showing the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the temptation and fall, and other key moments. Around these scenes, Michelangelo painted the prophets and sibyls who foretold the coming of Christ, along with the ancestors of Jesus and Ignudi, nude male figures of uncertain significance who hold bronze medallions. The most famous single image is the creation of Adam, showing God reaching out to give life to the first man. Adam reclines on the earth, his body perfect but listless, his finger extended toward the Creator. God reaches from a billowing cloud, surrounded by angels, his finger about to touch Adam's and transmit the spark of life. The few inches of space between the 2 fingers contain all the tension and mystery of the relationship between the divine and the human. The Sistine ceiling transformed the ceiling from a surface to be covered into a theater for the display of artistic genius. Its impact on subsequent art was immeasurable. For centuries, artists made pilgrimages to Rome to study Michelangelo's figures, to learn from his use of the human body, to express every variety of spiritual and emotional state. Michelangelo lived to be 88 years old, continuing to create significant works almost until his death in 1564. In his later years, he turned increasingly to architecture, designing buildings that were as revolutionary as his sculptures and paintings. His most significant architectural project was the completion of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The church had been under construction for decades when Michelangelo was appointed architect in 1546. He redesigned the building, simplifying some of the earlier plans while creating a more powerful and unified structure. His greatest contribution was the dome, which he designed but did not live to see completed. This great dome, visible from throughout Rome, became the model for countless later buildings, including the United States Capitol. Michelangelo's late sculptures are often unfinished, their figures emerging only partially from the raw marble. Some scholars believe this was intentional, a statement about the impossibility of fully realizing the ideal form that the artist perceived within the stone. Others suggest that Michelangelo simply lacked the energy to complete these works as he aged. Whatever the reason, these late pieces have a power that more polished works might lack, showing the struggle of creation itself. The Rondinini Pietà, on which Michelangelo was working just days before his death, shows the aged Virgin supporting the body of her dead son. The figures are elongated, almost ghostly, far from the muscular idealism of his earlier work. There is a tenderness and spirituality in this piece that suggests Michelangelo's own journey toward death, his own reflections on mortality, and the hope of resurrection. If Leonardo was the mysterious genius and Michelangelo the titanic creator, Raphael Sanzio was the perfect fulfillment of the Renaissance ideal. His art achieved a harmony, grace, and beauty that came to define what classical meant in Western art. Raphael was born in Urbino in 1483, the son of a painter who worked for the Duke of that small but cultivated court. He grew up surrounded by art and learning, absorbing the humanist culture that flourished under Federigo and Guidobaldo da Montefeltro. His father died when Raphael was 11, but the boy was already showing exceptional ability. By his late teens, Raphael had established himself as an independent master. He trained in the workshop of Perugino, one of the leading painters of central Italy. and quickly absorbed his master's style. But Raphael had an extraordinary ability to learn from other artists, while maintaining his own distinct identity. He would study the innovations of others, and incorporate them into his own work, often surpassing his models in the process. In 1504, Raphael came to Florence, where Leonardo and Michelangelo were both active. He studied Leonardo's use of sfumato and his psychological depth. He absorbed Michelangelo's powerful treatment of the human body. From these influences and others, he developed a style that combined the best elements of all, creating a synthesis that seemed to realize the full potential of Renaissance painting. The Madonnas that Raphael painted during his Florentine years became definitive images of the subject. The Madonna of the Goldfinch, the Madonna of the Meadow, and others show the Virgin and Child in landscapes of idealized beauty, their forms graceful and harmonious, their expressions tender and serene. These paintings established a type that would be imitated for centuries, an image of maternal love and divine grace that continues to shape our expectations of religious art. In 1508, the same year that Michelangelo began the Sistine ceiling, Raphael was summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II. He was commissioned to decorate a series of rooms in the Vatican Palace, the stands or chambers that served as the Pope's apartments. The most famous of these rooms is the Stanza della Segnatura, which Raphael decorated between 1509 and 1511. The frescoes in this room represent the highest achievements of human knowledge, philosophy, poetry, theology, and law. On one wall, the School of Athens depicts the great philosophers of antiquity gathered in a magnificent architectural space. On the opposite wall, the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament shows theologians of all ages contemplating the mystery of the Eucharist. The School of Athens has become one of the most recognized images in Western art. At the center stand Plato and Aristotle, the twin pillars of Greek philosophy. Plato, given the features of Leonardo da Vinci, points upward toward the realm of eternal ideas. Aristotle gestures outward toward the physical world of experience. Around them gather dozens of other philosophers: Socrates, Pythagoras, Euclid, Diogenes, and many more, each characterized through pose and gesture. The architectural setting is as impressive as the figures. A vast barrel-vaulted hall, inspired by ancient Roman buildings, and perhaps by Bramante's plans for the new St. Peter's, provides a space of sublime grandeur. The perspective draws the eye deep into the painted space, creating an illusion of actual depth that complements the intellectual depth of the subject. Raphael's frescoes demonstrate the Renaissance ideal of harmony between Christian and classical learning. The philosophers of the School of Athens and the theologians of the Disputation are not opposed but complementary. Human reason, exemplified by the ancient thinkers, prepares the way for divine revelation. The wisdom of antiquity finds its fulfillment in Christian truth. Besides his religious and allegorical works, Raphael was one of the greatest portrait painters of the Renaissance. His portraits capture not merely the appearance of his subjects, but their character, their dignity, and their inner life. The portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, painted around 1514, shows the author of the Book of the Courtier with understated elegance. Castiglione wears subdued colors, his clothing rich but not ostentatious. His expression is calm, intelligent, and slightly melancholy. The painting embodies the ideal of sprezzatura that Castiglione himself described in his book, an artful artlessness, a studied casualness that conceals the effort required to achieve it. Raphael's portrait of Pope Leo X shows the pontiff seated at a table with two cardinals, one of them the future Pope Clement VII. The Pope examines an illuminated manuscript with a magnifying glass, his face intelligent and somewhat fleshy. The rich textures of velvet and fur are rendered with extraordinary skill. The painting is at once an image of papal magnificence and a study of individual character. Raphael died in 1520, on Good Friday, at the age of 37. According to later accounts, all of Rome mourned his passing. He was buried in the Pantheon, the ancient Roman temple that had been converted into a church, and his epitaph declared that while he lived, nature feared being conquered by him, and when he died, she feared to die herself. The Rome that Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael knew was undergoing a transformation as dramatic as any in its long history. The Renaissance popes, beginning with Nicholas V in the mid-15th century and continuing through the early 16th, were determined to make Rome the greatest city in Christendom, a capital worthy of the universal church. When Martin V returned to Rome in 1420 after the end of the Great Schism, he found a city in ruins. The population had dropped to perhaps 25,000, a tiny fraction of the million or more who had lived there in imperial times. Buildings had collapsed, cattle grazed in the Forum. The once great aqueducts no longer functioned. The rebuilding of Rome was a project that occupied generations. Pope Nicholas V began the work, laying plans for a new Vatican palace and a rebuilt St. Peter's Basilica. His successors continued the effort, each adding to the transformation of the city. Streets were straightened and paved. Churches were built or renovated. Palaces rose for the cardinals and noble families who gathered around the papal court. The culmination of this building campaign came under Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513. Julius was a warrior pope, leading armies personally to reconquer territories that had slipped from papal control. But he was also a patron of the arts on a scale that rivaled any in history. It was Julius who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling and Raphael to decorate the Vatican stands. It was Julius who laid the foundation stone for the new St. Peter's, beginning a project that would take more than a century to complete. The architect of the new St. Peter's was Donato Bramante, who conceived a church of unprecedented scale. His design centered on a great dome over the crossing, with 4 equal arms extending in a Greek cross plan. Though Bramante's original design was modified by successors including Michelangelo, the basic conception remained a building that would surpass anything built in modern times, rivaling and even exceeding the achievements of ancient Rome. The papal court of the High Renaissance was one of the most brilliant in Europe. Cardinals from wealthy Italian families maintained households of hundreds of servants. Scholars, artists, and musicians gathered seeking patronage. Ambassadors from every European power vied for influence. The ceremonies of the church provided occasions for magnificent display, processions through the streets of Rome that demonstrated the power and splendor of the papacy. This concentration of wealth and power attracted talent from across Italy. Architects came to design palaces and churches. Painters came to decorate them. Scholars came to study in the Vatican Library, one of the finest collections of manuscripts in the world. The competition for papal patronage drove artists to ever greater achievements, knowing that success in Rome could make a career. But the brilliance of the Renaissance papacy was shadowed by corruption and worldliness. The popes of this period were as much Italian princes as they were spiritual leaders. They engaged in the factional politics of Italy, making war on rival states and seeking to advance their families. Several fathered children, despite their vows of celibacy, and worked to establish their offspring in positions of power. The sale of church offices became routine. Cardinals' hats could be purchased by the wealthy, regardless of their spiritual qualifications. Indulgences, documents promising remission of punishment for sins, were sold to raise money for building projects including St. Peter's. These practices enriched the church, but undermined its moral authority. The tension between the splendor of Renaissance Rome and the corruption that accompanied it would eventually produce a reaction. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther posted 95 theses, challenging the sale of indulgences, beginning a reformation that would split Western Christianity and bring an end to the unified Catholic culture of medieval Europe. But that story lies ahead of us. The High Renaissance in Rome came to a violent end in May 1527, when an army of Spanish and German soldiers sacked the city. The troops, unpaid and mutinous, broke through Rome's defenses and subjected the city to weeks of pillage, murder, and destruction. The sack of Rome was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Churches were plundered, their treasures stolen or destroyed. Libraries were scattered, irreplaceable manuscripts lost forever. Cardinals were held for ransom. The Pope himself took refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo. The population fled. Those who remained suffered violence and plague. When the soldiers finally departed, Rome was devastated. scholars, artists, and craftsmen scattered to other cities. The building projects that had transformed the city came to a halt. The confidence and optimism that had characterized the High Renaissance gave way to uncertainty and self-doubt. The sack of Rome is often taken as the end of the High Renaissance, the point at which the classical harmony achieved by Raphael and others gave way to the more complex, anxious styles of Mannerism. But historical periods do not end so neatly. The ideas and achievements of the Renaissance continued to develop and spread, even as the conditions that had produced them changed. What died in 1527 was not the Renaissance itself, but a particular moment of supreme confidence, a belief that modern Italians had equaled the ancients and would continue to surpass them. As we allow ourselves to sink deeper into relaxation, let us travel to Venice, the city of canals and lagoons, where the Renaissance took a distinctive form that would influence art for centuries. Venice in the 16th century was at the height of its power and glory. The Serenissima, as the Republic called itself, ruled a maritime empire stretching from the Adriatic across the eastern Mediterranean. Its merchants were among the wealthiest in Europe. Its government, stable and secretive, had maintained Venetian independence for centuries. And its artistic traditions, developing along their own path, were producing some of the greatest paintings ever created. Venetian painting differed from Florentine painting in fundamental ways. Where Florentine artists emphasized disegno, design or drawing, Venetian artists emphasized colorito, the use of color. The Florentines built their paintings from careful preparatory drawings, creating compositions of clear forms and precise contours. The Venetians worked more directly with paint, building up their images through layers of color that created effects of atmosphere and light. This difference in approach reflected the different conditions of the two cities. Florence was a city of stone, its clear Tuscan light revealing forms with sharp definition. Venice was a city of water, its light reflected and diffused by the canals and the sea, constantly changing with the weather and the time of day. Venetian painters learned to capture these atmospheric effects, creating paintings that seemed to glow with an inner light. The foundations of the great Venetian tradition were laid by Giovanni Bellini, who dominated Venetian painting in the second half of the 15th century. Bellini developed the use of oil paint to create effects of luminosity and depth that had never before been achieved. Oil painting had been developed in the Netherlands in the early 15th century, but it spread slowly to Italy. Bellini was among the first Italian painters to fully exploit the medium's possibilities. Oil paint dried slowly, allowing the artist to blend colors on the canvas and build up translucent glazes that gave depth and richness to his surfaces. The effect was like colored light rather than mere pigment on a surface. Bellini's altar pieces show the possibilities of this technique. The San Giobbe altarpiece, painted around 1487, depicts the Virgin and Child enthroned among saints in a setting that continues the architecture of the church itself. The light falls softly on the figures, unifying them in a warm golden atmosphere. The colors are deep and rich, the surfaces almost tactile in their rendering of flesh and fabric. Bellini also created some of the most beautiful landscape backgrounds in Renaissance art. His backgrounds are not merely settings for the sacred figures, but integral parts of the painting's meaning, suggesting the harmony between nature and grace. The soft hills, the distant towns, the atmosphere that fades toward the horizon, all contribute to the contemplative mood that characterizes his work. Giovanni Bellini's most gifted pupil was Giorgio da Castelfranco, known as Giorgiani. Though he died young, probably of plague in 1510, Giorgiani created works that established a new direction for Venetian painting. Giorgiani's paintings are often mysterious, their subjects uncertain, their meanings elusive. The Tempest, one of his most famous works, shows a soldier and a nude woman nursing a baby in a landscape where a storm is approaching. Who are these figures? What is their relationship? Why are they in this landscape? Generations of scholars have debated these questions without reaching consensus. Perhaps the questions miss the point. Giorgiani seems to have been less interested in narrative than in mood, less concerned with telling a story than with creating a poetic atmosphere. His paintings invite contemplation rather than interpretation. They suggest meanings without specifying them, creating a space for the viewer's imagination to fill. This approach to painting was revolutionary. It suggested that a painting could be valued for its formal qualities and emotional effects, rather than simply for its subject matter. A patron might commission a painting not to tell a particular story or commemorate a particular event, but simply to create a beautiful and evocative object for private contemplation. Giorgiano's influence was enormous, despite his small surviving body of work. His approach to color, atmosphere, and mood would be developed by his successors, particularly Titian, into a tradition that would dominate Venetian painting for the rest of the century and beyond. Tiziano Vecellio, known in English as Titian, was the supreme master of Venetian painting. Over a career spanning more than 60 years, he created works of such variety and power that he was recognized in his own time as one of the greatest artists who had ever lived. Titian was born around 1488 in Pieve di Cadore, a small town in the mountains north of Venice. He came to Venice as a boy and trained in the workshops of Gentile Bellini and then Giovanni Bellini before becoming associated with Giorgione. When Giorgione died in 1510, Titian emerged as the leading painter in Venice, a position he would hold for more than half a century. His Assumption of the Virgin, painted for the Frari Church in Venice between 1516 and 1518, announced his arrival as a major master. This enormous altarpiece, over 20 feet tall, shows the Virgin rising toward heaven, surrounded by angels, while the apostles below gesture in amazement. The composition is dynamic, the colors brilliant, the scale overwhelming. It established Titian as a painter capable of works rivaling those of Raphael and Michelangelo. Titian worked for the greatest patrons of his age. He painted mythological scenes for Duke Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, including the celebrated Bacchus and Ariadne. He created portraits that set the standard for the genre, depicting popes, emperors, and nobles with a psychological depth and visual magnificence that made his services in constant demand. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, became a devoted patron, eventually making Titian a count and declaring that only Titian should paint his portrait. Titian's technique evolved over his long career. His early works show the influence of Giovanni Bellini and Giorgione, with smooth surfaces and careful modeling. As he matured, his brushwork became freer, his colors richer, his treatment of light more atmospheric. In his late works, paint is applied in rough, almost violent strokes, forms dissolve into color and light, and the effect is one of profound emotional intensity. The Pietà that Titian was working on when he died in 1576, at the age of perhaps 90, shows this late style at its most powerful. The Virgin holds the dead Christ, while other figures mourn around them. The paint is applied in rough patches and streaks, the forms barely defined, the emotional impact almost overwhelming. It is an image of grief and hope, of death and the promise of resurrection, created by an artist who knew his own death was approaching. Beyond Venice and Florence, other Italian centers developed their own distinctive Renaissance cultures. The smaller courts of northern Italy, though lacking the resources of the major powers, produced some of the most refined and sophisticated cultural achievements of the era. Mantua, ruled by the Gonzaga family, was particularly notable for its patronage of the arts. The Gonzagas had ruled Mantua since the 14th century, transforming a modest city-state into a center of humanist culture. Their court attracted poets, musicians, and artists, creating an environment where the arts flourished. The most significant artistic achievement of the Mantuan court was the Camera degli Sposi, or bridal chamber, painted by Andrea Mantegna in the 1470s. Mantegna covered the walls and ceiling of this small room with frescoes depicting members of the Gonzaga family, creating an illusion of space that dissolves the boundaries between the real room and the painted scenes. The ceiling is particularly remarkable. Mantegna painted an oculus, a circular opening through which figures look down at the viewer below. Servants, putti, and even a peacock peer over a balustrade, their figures foreshortened as if seen from directly below. This use of illusionistic perspective, creating the impression of a painted space that extends the real space of the room, would be developed by later artists into some of the most spectacular ceiling decorations of the Baroque period. Isabella d'Este, who became Marchioness of Mantua through her marriage to Francesco Gonzaga in 1490, was one of the most cultured women of the Renaissance. She assembled a celebrated collection of art and antiquities, commissioning works from the leading artists of her time including Mantegna, Perugino, and eventually Titian. Her studiolo, a private room devoted to study and contemplation, became famous throughout Europe for its decorations and the objects it contained. Isabella corresponded with artists, scholars, and rulers across Italy, seeking always the finest and rarest objects for her collection. Her letters reveal a woman of sophisticated taste and determined will, willing to negotiate hard to get what she wanted. When artists were slow to deliver commissioned works, she pursued them relentlessly. When dealers offered items of doubtful quality, she rejected them firmly. She was in many ways the model of the Renaissance collector. Ferrara, ruled by the Este family, was another center of northern Italian culture. The Este had transformed Ferrara from a small town into a proper Renaissance city, with broad streets, imposing palaces, and a court that rivaled any in Italy. Ferrara was particularly known for its literary culture. The poets Matteo Maria Boiado and Ludovico Ariosto both worked for the Este court, creating the chivalric epics that became among the most popular works of Renaissance literature. Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, a vast poem of love and war set against the background of Charlemagne's struggle against the Saracens, was read throughout Europe and influenced writers for centuries. The Este also patronized music, making Ferrara one of the leading centers of musical development. Composers from across Europe came to the Este court, creating new forms and styles that spread throughout the musical world. The virtuoso singing of the Concerto del Don, a group of highly trained female performers at the court in the later 16th century, became famous throughout Europe. In the visual arts, Ferrara developed its own distinctive school. Cosimo Tura, Francesco del Casa, and Arcole de Roberti created paintings of strange intensity, their figures angular and expressive, their colors metallic and jewel-like. The style was unlike anything produced elsewhere in Italy, reflecting the particular tastes and traditions of the Ferrers court. The small duchy of Urbino, in the mountainous region of the March, became under Duke Federigo da Montefeltro one of the most admired courts in Italy. Federigo, a successful condottiero who earned his fortune fighting for various employers, used his wealth to transform Urbino into a center of humanist culture. Federigo's palace at Urbino is a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture. Its design, attributed to various architects but particularly associated with Luciano Laurana, creates a sense of harmonious proportion that impressed all who visited. The Duke's studiolo, its walls covered with intricate intarsia panels depicting books, musical instruments, and scholarly objects, expressed the ideal of the cultured prince devoted to learning. Federigo assembled one of the finest libraries in Europe, employing teams of scribes to copy classical texts. He was said to have refused printed books, preferring the elegance of hand-copied manuscripts. His collection, later absorbed into the Vatican Library, included rare and important texts that scholars traveled great distances to consult. It was at Urbino, in the generation after Federigo's death, that Baldassare Castiglione set his famous dialogue The Book of the Courtier. This work, published in 1528, presented an idealized portrait of court life, describing the qualities that a perfect courtier should possess: grace, elegance, learning, skill in arms and arts, easy conversation, and above all sprezzatura, the quality of making difficult achievements seem effortless, all characterized the ideal courtier. The Book of the Courtier became one of the most influential works of the Renaissance. It was translated into every major European language and shaped ideas about aristocratic behavior for centuries. The image of the Renaissance gentleman that it presented, cultured and graceful, skilled in war and love, became a model that people across Europe sought to emulate. As you continue to relax, let us consider another dimension of the Renaissance, the investigation of the natural world. The Renaissance was not only an age of art and literature, but also an age of exploration, observation, and the beginnings of what would become modern science. Renaissance thinkers approached nature with new curiosity and new methods. They were not content simply to repeat what ancient authorities had said about the natural world. They wanted to observe nature directly, to see for themselves how things worked, to test claims against experience. This empirical approach had roots in both the revival of ancient texts and the practical needs of Renaissance society. The recovery of Greek scientific writings, particularly the works of Archimedes and other mathematical authors, provided models for rigorous investigation. Meanwhile, artists, engineers, architects, and navigators needed practical knowledge that could only come from direct observation and experiment. Leonardo da Vinci exemplified this union of art and science. His anatomical studies, based on dissection of human corpses, revealed the structure of the body with unprecedented accuracy. His observations of water, birds, and geological formations filled thousands of notebook pages. He approached every phenomenon with the same questioning curiosity, seeking to understand the principles that governed the natural world. But Leonardo was not alone in this empirical approach. Throughout Italy, practical men were making observations and developing techniques that would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution. Venetian shipbuilders developed new methods for constructing and navigating vessels. Florentine engineers tackled problems of hydraulics and mechanics. Military architects studied ballistics to design more effective fortifications. The study of human anatomy made particular advances during the Renaissance. Medieval physicians had relied largely on ancient authorities, particularly Galen, whose writings from the 2nd century had dominated medical education for over 1,000 years. But Renaissance anatomists began to question Galen's conclusions by examining bodies for themselves. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish physician who worked in Italy, published in 1543 his monumental work on the fabric of the human body. This book, illustrated with detailed and beautiful woodcuts, corrected numerous errors in Galen's anatomy. Vesalius had dissected human bodies systematically, observing structures that Galen, who had worked mainly with animal cadavers, had described incorrectly. The publication of Vesalius's work marked a turning point in medical history. It established that ancient authorities could be wrong, and that direct observation was necessary for accurate knowledge. Though Vesalius himself remained largely within the framework of ancient medicine, his method pointed toward a more empirical approach. Italian universities, particularly Padua, became centers for anatomical research. The university built a permanent anatomical theater where dissections could be observed by students and visiting scholars. The tradition of anatomical investigation that developed there would continue to produce important discoveries throughout the 16th century and beyond. The Renaissance also saw the beginnings of a transformation in humanity's understanding of the universe. For centuries, Europeans had accepted the Ptolemaic system, which placed the Earth at the center of the cosmos, with the sun, moon, planets, and stars revolving around it. This system seemed to accord with both common sense and scripture, and it had been elaborated by medieval astronomers into a complex but workable model. In 1543, the same year that Vesalius published his anatomy, a Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus published on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, which proposed that the sun, not the Earth, was at the center of the planetary system. Copernicus had developed his heliocentric theory while living in Italy in the early years of the century, absorbing the humanist atmosphere that encouraged questioning of ancient authorities. Copernicus's theory did not immediately transform astronomical thinking. Many astronomers continued to prefer the Ptolemaic system, which seemed to fit the observed data equally well and did not require believing that the Earth moved through space. But the Copernican hypothesis had been published and could be studied and developed by later thinkers. The full development of Copernican astronomy would come in the early 17th century, with the observations of Galileo Galilei and the calculations of Johannes Kepler. But the seeds of this transformation were planted in the Renaissance, in an intellectual culture that valued inquiry and was willing to question received wisdom. Let us pause again for a moment of rest. Feel the weight of your body settling into stillness. Let your breathing become slow and easy. Allow the images and ideas we have explored to drift gently through your mind, without effort or tension. The High Renaissance was an age of extraordinary achievement. In the space of a few decades, artists and thinkers created works that continue to inspire and challenge us today. The Sistine Ceiling, the Mona Lisa, the School of Athens, the writings of Machiavelli and Castiglione, the beginnings of modern science. All this emerged from a small peninsula in a few turbulent decades. What drove this explosion of creativity? The wealth accumulated over centuries of commerce. The competition among states that rewarded excellence. The recovery of ancient learning that provided both models and inspiration. The patronage of popes and princes, who saw cultural achievement as an extension of their power. All these factors contributed to an environment where genius could flourish. But ultimately, the Renaissance was made by individuals, by Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael and countless others, who devoted their lives to the pursuit of excellence. They worked long hours in workshops and studios. They struggled with difficult problems. They experienced failure as well as success. They were human beings, with human limitations and human concerns, who nonetheless achieved things that seemed to exceed human capacity. Rest now, and let these thoughts settle into your mind. When you are ready, we will continue our journey, exploring how Renaissance ideas spread beyond Italy, and how the changes set in motion in these decades would transform not just art, but society itself. Among the most influential ideas to emerge from Renaissance Italy were those concerning politics and government. Medieval political thought had been dominated by questions of legitimacy and divine authority. Renaissance thinkers began to ask different questions. How does power actually work? What makes some states strong and others weak? How can leaders achieve their goals? No one addressed these questions more provocatively than Niccolò Machiavelli. Born in Florence in 1469, Machiavelli served for 14 years as a diplomat and administrator for the Florentine Republic. He was sent on missions to foreign powers, observed political leaders in action, and gained practical experience in the exercise of government. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, Machiavelli was dismissed from office, briefly imprisoned and tortured on suspicion of conspiracy, and forced into retirement. In his rural exile, he turned to writing, producing works that would make him one of the most famous and controversial thinkers in history. The Prince, written in 1513 though not published until after his death, offered advice to rulers on how to acquire and maintain political power. The book shocked readers with its apparent amorality. Machiavelli seemed to advise princes to use whatever means were necessary, including deception and violence, to achieve their ends. He praised Cesare Borgia, the ruthless son of Pope Alexander VI, for his effective, if brutal, methods. Whether Machiavelli actually endorsed the methods he described, or whether he was simply describing political reality as he observed it, remains debated. Some readers have seen The Prince as a sincere handbook for tyrants. Others have viewed it as a satire, exposing the cruel logic of power to public scrutiny. Still others have argued that Machiavelli was a Republican at heart, as his other writings suggest, and that The Prince should be read in the context of his larger body of work. Whatever Machiavelli's intentions, The Prince had an enormous impact. The term Machiavellian entered the language as a synonym for cunning and unscrupulous. Generations of political leaders read the book, some openly, others secretly, and political thought was permanently changed by Machiavelli's insistence that politics should be analyzed in terms of how power actually operates, not how moralists say it should operate. The humanist movement that had begun with Petrarch continued to develop throughout the Renaissance, shaping education and cultural values across Europe. By the 16th century, humanist principles dominated the education of elite males throughout Italy and were spreading to the rest of Europe. The humanist curriculum centered on the study of classical languages and literature. Students learned Latin grammar from ancient authors, developing the ability to write in a pure classical style. Greek was added for the most advanced students. They read histories, learning from the examples of ancient statesmen and generals. They studied rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. They absorbed moral philosophy, seeking guidance for how to live. This education was designed to produce virtuous and effective citizens. Humanists believed that the study of great literature would shape character, That exposure to noble examples would inspire noble behavior. They argued that their education was superior to the scholastic training of medieval universities, which they saw as dry and technical, focused on logic chopping rather than the cultivation of wisdom. Humanist education also emphasized physical training and social graces. The complete human being, in the humanist view, was accomplished not only in scholarship but also in the arts of war and peace. He could ride and fence as well as write and speak. He could compose poetry and appreciate music. He moved gracefully in society, conversing with wit and charm. This ideal found its fullest expression in Castigliani's Book of the Courtier, which we have already discussed. But it was also expressed in countless educational treatises, conduct manuals, and letters of advice written during the Renaissance. The ideal of the well-rounded individual, educated in both humanities and what we would now call liberal arts, continues to influence education today. One of the important debates among Renaissance humanists concerned the question of language. Latin had been the language of scholarship and serious writing throughout the Middle Ages. Should it remain so, or should writers use the vernacular languages, the everyday speech of their various regions? The humanists' reverence for Latin initially reinforced its dominance. The ability to write correct, elegant Latin was the mark of an educated person. Scholars throughout Europe could communicate in Latin regardless of their native tongues. Important works were written in Latin to reach the widest possible audience of educated readers, but at the same time, the vernacular languages were developing literary traditions of their own. Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio had demonstrated that Italian could be a vehicle for literature of the highest quality. Their works were read and admired throughout Italy, helping to establish Tuscan Italian as a literary language that rose above local dialects. By the 16th century, the question of language had become a subject of intense debate. Pietro Bembo argued that literary Italian should follow the models of Petrarch in poetry and Boccaccio in prose, establishing classical standards for the vernacular comparable to those for Latin. Others argued for a more natural, less imitative approach to the Italian language. The resolution of this debate had significant consequences. The development of standardized vernacular languages, with recognized grammatical rules and literary models, helped create the modern European languages. It also made literature accessible to readers who lacked Latin education, broadening the audience for literary culture. And it contributed to the emergence of national identities based on shared language and literature. As we bring this second part of our journey to a close, let us rest with what we have learned. We have explored the High Renaissance, that remarkable period when Italian art and culture reached heights that still inspire us today. We have walked through the workshops of Leonardo, watched Michelangelo create figures of superhuman power, admired the harmony of Raphael's compositions. We have seen how Venice developed its own distinctive tradition, using color and light to create paintings of extraordinary beauty. We have visited the courts of northern Italy, where cultivated princes created environments where the arts could flourish. We have considered the beginnings of modern science and the political ideas that emerged from Renaissance Italy. The High Renaissance was a time of supreme confidence, when Italian artists and thinkers believed they had equaled or surpassed the achievements of antiquity. That confidence would be shaken by the disasters that befell Italy in the early 16th century, by invasions, warfare, and the sack of Rome. But the achievements remained, and they continued to influence art and thought long after the specific conditions that had produced them had changed. In the parts that follow, we will explore how Renaissance ideas spread across Europe and how they continued to develop in Italy itself. We will see how the religious upheavals of the 16th century transformed culture and society. And we will consider the legacy of the Renaissance, its influence on the world that came after and on our own time. For now, rest peacefully. Let the images of the High Renaissance drift through your dreams. The Sistine ceiling arches above you. The Mona Lisa smiles her mysterious smile. The canals of Venice gleam in the afternoon light. This is the world of the Renaissance, and it is yours to explore whenever you choose. Sleep now, and when you are ready, we will continue our journey together. Welcome back to our exploration of Renaissance Italy. As you settle into a comfortable position, allow your breathing to become slow and natural. Let the tension drain from your body, and let your mind become receptive to the stories that await. In the first two parts of our journey, we traced the origins and flowering of the Italian Renaissance. We watched Florence become the cradle of a new age of culture. We met the great artists of the High Renaissance and explored their achievements. Now we turn to a more complex chapter in our story, the challenges that confronted Italy and the changes that transformed Renaissance culture in the 16th century. These were turbulent times. Foreign armies invaded Italy, turning the peninsula into a battleground. Religious reform swept across Europe, dividing Christendom and provoking conflicts that would last for generations. The confidence of the High Renaissance gave way to new forms of artistic expression, more complex and sometimes more troubled than what had come before. Yet even in these difficult times, extraordinary achievements continued. Artists developed new styles that would influence art for centuries. Writers and thinkers grappled with the great questions of their age. The Renaissance continued to evolve, adapting to new circumstances while building on the foundations that had been laid. Let the gentle rhythm of this narrative carry you toward peaceful rest. These stories of challenge and change remind us that creativity can flourish even in difficult times, that human beings can create beauty and meaning regardless of the circumstances they face. The political stability that had allowed the High Renaissance to flourish came to an end in 1494, when King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy with the most powerful army Europe had seen in centuries. This invasion began a period of warfare that would devastate the Italian peninsula for over 6 decades and fundamentally transform its political situation. Charles VIII had a claim to the throne of Naples through his grandmother, and he was determined to assert it. But his ambitions went beyond Naples. He dreamed of using Italy as a base for a crusade to recapture Constantinople and Jerusalem. His invasion was the first step in a grand vision that would never be realized. The Italian states were unprepared for the French onslaught. Decades of peace had allowed armies to decline. The condottieri system, which had maintained a balance among the Italian powers, proved useless against the disciplined French forces with their superior artillery. City after city fell with little resistance. The immediate cause of the invasion was an invitation from Ludovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, who hoped to use French power against his rival Naples. Ludovico would live to regret this invitation. The French had no intention of serving as tools of Italian diplomacy. They had their own goals and would pursue them relentlessly. Charles VIII marched through Italy with astonishing speed. Florence, where Piero de' Medici had succeeded Lorenzo the Magnificent, surrendered without a fight. Piero was driven from the city by a popular uprising, beginning an 18-year period of republican government. Rome offered no resistance. Pope Alexander VI retreated to the Castel Sant'Angelo and watched the French army march past. Naples fell easily, its king fleeing before Charles's advance, but holding Italy proved harder than conquering it. The Italian states, belatedly recognizing the danger, formed a league against France. Charles, forced to fight his way back home, barely escaped with his army intact. He died a few years later, but his invasion had demonstrated Italian vulnerability and established a pattern that would be repeated for decades. The French returned under Charles's successor, Louis XII, who had claims to both Naples and Milan. Spain, emerging as a great power under Ferdinand and Isabella, contested French ambitions. For the next half-century, Italy became a battleground where French and Spanish armies, along with German and Swiss mercenaries, fought for control. The wars were devastating for the Italian population. Armies lived off the land, seizing food and supplies wherever they went. Sieges destroyed cities. Plague and famine followed in the wake of armies. The prosperity that the Italian cities had enjoyed began to decline as trade was disrupted and productive resources destroyed. Politically, the Italian states were reduced from players to pawns. Venice, despite its wealth and naval power, could not resist the combined forces arrayed against it in the War of the League of Cambrai. Florence oscillated between Medici rule and republican government, its politics increasingly shaped by outside powers. The papacy became enmeshed in the wars, forming and breaking alliances as circumstances dictated. The culmination of this devastation came in May 1527, with the sack of Rome that we discussed earlier. The army that sacked Rome consisted largely of unpaid German and Spanish soldiers who had mutinied against their commanders. For weeks they pillaged the city, killing, raping, and destroying. The psychological impact was enormous. Many saw the sack as divine punishment for the sins of the church. The supreme confidence of the High Renaissance died in those terrible weeks. The Italian wars finally wound down in the 1550s. By the Peace of Cato Cambrases in 1559, Spain had established dominance over much of the peninsula. The Spanish controlled Naples directly, as they had for decades. Milan became a Spanish dependency. The smaller states aligned themselves with Spanish policy. Only Venice maintained genuine independence, and even Venice had to accommodate itself to Spanish power. The end of the wars brought peace, but at the price of independence. For the next century and a half, until the War of the Spanish Succession at the beginning of the 18th century, Italy would be largely a Spanish sphere of influence. The political fragmentation that had contributed to Renaissance creativity now became a source of weakness, with the Italian states unable to resist foreign domination. The long-term effects of the Italian wars on Renaissance culture were complex. The devastation disrupted the patronage networks that had supported artists and scholars. The centers of cultural innovation began to shift northward, to France, England, and the Netherlands. Yet the wars also spread Italian culture throughout Europe, as foreign soldiers and administrators encountered the achievements of the Renaissance and carried ideas and styles back to their homelands. While foreign armies devastated Italy, a different kind of challenge was arising in the north. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther posted 95 theses questioning the sale of indulgences, beginning a religious revolution that would split Western Christendom. Luther's initial concern was with what he saw as the corruption of the church, particularly the practice of selling indulgences to raise money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome. But his challenge quickly expanded into a fundamental critique of Catholic theology and the authority of the papacy. He argued that salvation came through faith alone, not through works or church rituals. He insisted that Scripture was the sole authority for Christian belief, rejecting the accumulated traditions of the Church. And he denied that the Pope had any special authority beyond what any other bishop possessed. These ideas spread rapidly through Germany and beyond, helped by the printing press that allowed Luther's writings to reach a mass audience. By the 1520s, large parts of Northern Europe were in religious turmoil. Princes and cities adopted the new Protestant faith, sometimes from genuine conviction, sometimes from a desire to seize church property and assert independence from Rome. Italy was largely insulated from the early spread of Protestantism. The Italian peninsula remained overwhelmingly Catholic, and the few Protestants who emerged were quickly suppressed. But Italy could not escape the consequences of the Reformation. The division of Europe into Catholic and Protestant camps would shape politics for centuries, and the Catholic Church itself would be forced to respond to the Protestant challenge with its own program of reform. The Catholic response to Protestantism came to be called the Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation. Its centerpiece was the Council of Trent, which met in 3 sessions between 1545 and 1563 to clarify Catholic doctrine and address the abuses that had provoked Luther's critique. The council met in the city of Trent, in northern Italy, chosen because it was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, and thus acceptable to the German bishops who were expected to attend. The debates were often contentious, with different factions within the church advocating different approaches, but the council eventually produced a comprehensive restatement of Catholic teaching and a program of practical reforms. On matters of doctrine, the council largely reaffirmed traditional Catholic positions. It declared that salvation came through both faith and works, rejecting Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone. It affirmed the authority of tradition alongside Scripture. It maintained the special role of the Pope and the validity of the 7 sacraments. On these fundamental issues, the Council drew a clear line between Catholic and Protestant belief. On matters of practice, The council addressed many of the abuses that had provoked criticism. It established seminaries for the training of priests, recognizing that ignorant and poorly prepared clergy had contributed to the church's problems. It required bishops to reside in their dioceses, rather than collecting income from afar. It regulated indulgences and other practices that had been sources of scandal. The council also addressed the arts. It affirmed that religious images were legitimate aids to devotion, but insisted that they should be clear, decorous, and free from anything that might be considered improper or misleading. This had significant consequences for religious art, encouraging a more didactic approach that would communicate Catholic teaching clearly to the faithful. The Counter-Reformation transformed the religious and cultural landscape of Italy. The Church, having been shaken by the Protestant challenge and the sack of Rome, became more disciplined, more centralized, and more assertive. The Inquisition, established in Rome in 1542, sought out and punished heresy. The Index of Forbidden Books, first published in 1559, listed works that Catholics were forbidden to read. This climate of religious authority affected all areas of Italian culture. Writers and artists became more cautious about anything that might be construed as unorthodox. The playful exploration of pagan mythology that had characterized some Renaissance art gave way to more explicitly religious subjects. The nude figures that Michelangelo had painted on the Sistine ceiling were later deemed inappropriate and partially covered with drapery. Yet the Counter-Reformation also inspired new forms of cultural expression. The Jesuits, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, became major patrons of education and the arts. Their churches, designed to impress and inspire, became showcases for the emerging Baroque style. Their schools spread throughout Europe and beyond, carrying Renaissance humanism in a more explicitly Catholic form. The religious fervor of the Counter-Reformation found expression in the lives of saints and mystics. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross in Spain, Philip Neri in Rome, and many others combined intense personal spirituality with active engagement in the world. Their writings and example shaped Catholic piety for centuries. The confidence and harmony of high Renaissance art began to give way, even before the sack of Rome, to new artistic approaches that scholars have called mannerism. This term, derived from the Italian maniera meaning style or stylishness, describes an art that departed from the classical balance achieved by Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael in favor of deliberate sophistication and complexity. The Mannerist artists were not ignorant of classical principles. On the contrary, they had mastered those principles thoroughly, studying the works of the high Renaissance masters as models of perfection. But having mastered the rules, they chose to break them, creating effects of tension, ambiguity, and elegant artificiality that distinguished their work from their predecessors. The causes of this shift are debated. Some scholars emphasize the impact of political and religious crises, which may have undermined the confidence that had supported classical balance. Others point to the anxiety of influence, the difficulty younger artists faced in competing with masters who seemed to have achieved perfection. Still others see mannerism as a natural development within the artistic tradition, as artists sought novelty by pushing beyond established norms. Whatever its causes, mannerism produced art of remarkable sophistication. The elongated figures, complex spatial arrangements, and unusual colors of Mannerist paintings create effects quite different from the harmony of the high Renaissance. These are works that reward extended contemplation, revealing new complexities the longer one looks. Among the first and most original of the Mannerist painters were Jacopo Pontormo and Rosso Fiorentino, both trained in Florence in the years around 1520. Their works show how quickly the lessons of the high Renaissance were being transformed into something new. Pontormo's Deposition, painted around 1528 for the Church of Santa Felicita in Florence, exemplifies the Mannerist approach. The scene shows the body of Christ being lowered from the cross, but the composition is strikingly unconventional. The figures are arranged in a spiraling, almost floating formation, with no clear ground plane to anchor them. The colors are strange acid pinks and greens that seem to come from no natural palette. The faces are beautiful but troubled, their expressions ambiguous. The effect is one of spiritual intensity and emotional complexity. The viewer is drawn into the scene, forced to work to understand the spatial relationships and emotional dynamics. There is no single focus, no resting place for the eye. The painting demands active engagement rather than passive contemplation. Rosso Fiorentino's Deposition, painted a few years earlier for a church in Volterra, takes a different approach, but achieves similar effects of disquiet. The figures are arranged on a grid of ladders against the cross, their movements awkward and angular. The colors are harsh, the contrast dramatic. The emotional tenor is one of anguish rather than serene grief. Both Pontormo and Rosso eventually left Florence, Rosso going to France, where he helped establish the school of Fontainebleau, an important center for the spread of Italian Renaissance ideas to Northern Europe. Their early works in Florence, however, announced a new direction for Italian art, one that would be developed by many followers. Francesco Mazzola, known as Parmigianino from his birthplace of Parma, developed mannerism in the direction of elegant artificiality. His figures are impossibly elongated, their limbs stretched to create effects of graceful sophistication. His surfaces are smooth and polished, his colors cool and refined. The Madonna with the long neck, painted in the 1530s, shows Parmigianino's approach at its most extreme. The Virgin is depicted with a neck of improbable length, her body elongated and serpentine. The Christ child in her lap is large and strangely adult. A line of columns in the background establishes no coherent spatial relationship with the foreground figures. The painting is beautiful but unsettling, its distortions clearly deliberate. Parmigianino's self-portrait in a convex mirror, painted when he was about 21, shows his technical virtuosity and his interest in optical effects. He depicted himself as seen in a curved mirror, with his hand enlarged in the foreground and his features slightly distorted by the curved surface. The painting is a display of skill, a demonstration that the artist could capture even the most challenging visual effects. The elegant mannerism that Parmigianino developed proved highly influential. His elongated figures and refined surfaces were imitated throughout Italy and eventually across Europe. The ideal of sophisticated artifice that his work embodied became a hallmark of court culture in the later 16th century. Agnolo di Cosimo, known as Bronzino, was the leading painter at the court of Cosimo I de' Medici, who had restored Medici rule in Florence in 1537 and was establishing his family as hereditary dukes. Bronzino's portraits captured the image that the new Medici court wished to project: elegant, controlled, and impenetrably dignified. Bronzino's portraits show their subjects in elaborate costumes, their poses formal, their expressions revealing nothing. The surfaces are hard and polished, the colors cool. These are images of power, presenting their subjects as figures of authority whose inner thoughts remain completely hidden. The portrait of Eleanor of Toledo with her son Giovanni shows the Duchess in a magnificent brocade dress, her face beautiful but mask-like, her hand resting possessively on her son's shoulder. The painting is a statement of dynastic power, presenting the Duchess as a figure of ornamental magnificence who will perpetuate the Medici line. Bronzino also created allegorical paintings of striking complexity. The allegory of Venus and Cupid, painted for Francis I of France, shows Venus and her son in an embrace surrounded by figures representing time, folly, and other abstractions. The painting is deliberately puzzling, its meanings debated by scholars ever since. This quality of sophisticated ambiguity was prized by the courtly audiences for whom such works were created. While painting was being transformed by mannerism, architecture developed in new directions as well. The most influential architect of the later 16th century was Andrea Palladio, whose buildings in Venice and the surrounding Veneto region established a classical style that would be imitated across Europe and America for centuries. Palladio was born in 1508 in Padua and trained as a stonemason before being taken up by a humanist patron who encouraged his architectural studies. He traveled to Rome to study ancient buildings firsthand, measuring and drawing the ruins with careful precision. From these studies, he developed a personal style based on classical principles, but adapted to the needs of his own time and place. Palladio's most innovative works were the villas he designed for the Venetian nobility, country houses on the mainland that served both as working farms and as retreats from the city. These villas combined practical agricultural functions with classical grandeur, their central blocks fronted by temple-like porticos while service wings extended to the sides. The Villa Rotonda, near Vicenza, is perhaps Palladio's most famous building. It consists of a central cubic block with identical temple front porticos on all four sides, creating a perfectly symmetrical design. The building sits on a hilltop, its porticos framing views in every direction. The effect is one of classical harmony perfectly adapted to its landscape setting. In Venice itself, Palladio designed churches that brought Roman grandeur to the city of canals. San Giorgio Maggiore, standing on its own island across the basin from St. Mark's Square, presents a facade that combines elements from Roman temple architecture into a new and influential composition. The interior is filled with light, its white surfaces creating an effect of serene spaciousness. Palladio also wrote extensively about architecture. His 4 books of architecture, published in 1570, combined practical instruction with illustrations of his own designs and the ancient buildings he had studied. This book became one of the most influential architectural treatises ever written, spreading Palladio's ideas throughout Europe and eventually to America, where his influence can be seen in buildings from Jefferson's Monticello to countless courthouses and public buildings. Another influential architect of the later 16th century was Giacomo Barozzi da Vignola, who designed the Church of the Gesù in Rome, the mother church of the Jesuit order. This building established a new model for church architecture that would be widely imitated in the Counter-Reformation period. The Gesù was designed to serve the needs of Jesuit preaching, with a wide nave providing clear sight lines to the altar and pulpit. Side aisles were eliminated in favor of interconnected chapels, creating a more unified interior space. The facade, though completed by another architect after Vignola's death, established an influential type, with its 2 stories of pilasters and pediments, and its scrolling volutes connecting the narrower upper story to the wider lower one. The interior of the Gesù was originally relatively austere, but it was later decorated with elaborate Baroque frescoes and gilded ornament that transformed it into one of the most opulent spaces in Rome. This development illustrated a general tendency of Counter-Reformation architecture, buildings designed on classical principles, but decorated with increasingly elaborate ornament that created effects of overwhelming grandeur. The later 16th century also saw the institutionalization of art and architecture through the founding of academies. The most important of these was the Accademia del Disegno, established in Florence in 1563 under the patronage of Cosimo I de' Medici. The leading figure in this academy was Giorgio Vasari, architect, painter, and above all author of the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects. This massive work, first published in 1550 and expanded in 1568, told the story of Italian art from Cimabue and Giotto through Vasari's own contemporaries. It established the narrative framework through which the Renaissance has been understood ever since a rebirth of the arts after the darkness of the Middle Ages, developing through a series of stages toward the perfection achieved by Michelangelo. Vasari's lives combined biography, criticism, and historical narrative. He gathered information from documents, oral traditions, and his own observations, creating portraits of artists that brought them to life as individuals. His judgments shaped later understanding of which artists mattered and which did not. His concept of art history as a story of progress toward perfection influenced all subsequent art historical writing. The academy that Vasari helped found institutionalized the training of artists in Florence. Young artists could receive systematic instruction in drawing, anatomy, and other fundamentals. Regular meetings provided opportunities for discussion and debate about artistic principles. The academy model would spread throughout Europe, shaping artistic education until the 20th century. Allow yourself to relax more deeply as we explore another dimension of Renaissance culture: music. The sounds of the Renaissance, though we cannot hear them directly, were as much a part of that world as the paintings and sculptures that survive. Italy was not initially the leader in Renaissance music. In the 15th century, the most innovative composers came from the Netherlands and Burgundy, bringing a polyphonic style that wove multiple melodic lines into complex textures. Italian courts and churches imported northern composers and trained Italian musicians in northern techniques. But by the 16th century, Italian music had come into its own. Italian composers developed new forms and styles that would influence European music for generations. The madrigal, the opera, and new approaches to church music all emerged from Italy in this period. The madrigal was a form of secular vocal music, setting Italian poetry to music for a small group of singers. Unlike earlier forms that treated text as subordinate to musical pattern, the madrigal sought to express the meaning and emotion of the words through music. Composers used harmonic changes, melodic gestures, and contrasts of texture to paint the text in sound. The great madrigalists of the 16th century created works of remarkable sophistication. Carlo Gesualdo, Prince of Venosa, pushed harmonic experimentation to extremes, using chromatic progressions that would not become common again for 3 centuries. Claudio Monteverdi, whose career bridged the 16th and 17th centuries, developed the expressive possibilities of the madrigal to new heights before turning to the new form of opera. The most significant musical development of the late Renaissance was the invention of opera, which combined music, drama, and spectacle into a new art form. Opera emerged from the efforts of a group of scholars, poets, and musicians in Florence, the Camerata, who sought to recreate what they believed was the musical drama of ancient Greece. The Greeks, the Camerata believed, had sung their dramas rather than simply speaking them. The emotional power of Greek tragedy came in part from this musical dimension, which modern drama had lost. By setting dramatic texts to music that followed the natural rhythms of speech, modern artists could recover something of ancient power. The earliest operas, created around 1600, set mythological subjects to music that sought expressiveness above all. The vocal line followed the patterns of speech, rising and falling with the emotions of the characters. This recitative style was interrupted by more structured musical passages for moments of particular intensity. The first opera that has survived complete is Eurydice by Jacopo Peri, performed in Florence in 1600 for the wedding celebrations of Maria de Medici and Henry IV of France. But the first operatic masterpiece was Orphee by Claudio Monteverdi, performed in Mantua in 1607. Monteverdi's genius transformed the experimental form into an art of profound emotional power, using a larger orchestra and more varied musical resources to tell the story of Orpheus and his attempt to rescue Eurydice from the underworld. Opera would become one of the dominant art forms of the following centuries, spreading from Italy throughout Europe. Its combination of music, drama, and visual spectacle made it the most ambitious and expensive of art forms, a showcase for princely magnificence. The Renaissance, in giving birth to opera, created a form that would shape Western culture for 400 years. Religious music was also transformed in the 16th century, partly in response to the reforms of the Council of Trent. The council addressed music in its deliberations, expressing concern that the elaborate polyphony of contemporary church music made the sacred words incomprehensible. Legend has it that sacred polyphony was saved by Giovanni Pieriluigi da Palestrina, who composed a mass that demonstrated that complex music could still make the words clear. Whether or not this legend is literally true, Palestrina became the model of correct church music for the Counter-Reformation. His compositions balanced polyphonic complexity with textual clarity, creating music of serene beauty that remained the standard for Catholic sacred music for centuries. The Venetian composers developed a different approach, exploiting the unique architecture of St. Mark's Basilica with its multiple choir lofts. Andrea and Giovanni Gabrieli composed for multiple choirs, positioned in different parts of the church, creating effects of spatial contrast and overwhelming grandeur. Their music anticipated the Baroque style that would dominate the 17th century, with its emphasis on dramatic contrasts and emotional intensity. Italian literature continued to develop throughout the 16th century, building on the foundations laid by Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. Writers grappled with questions of language, form, and the relationship between ancient models and contemporary creativity. The epic poem reached new heights in the work of Ludovico Ariosto and Torquato Tasso. Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, published in its final form in 1532, combined romantic adventure, comedy, and satire in a vast narrative of love and war. The poem drew on the medieval tradition of chivalric romance, but treated it with a sophisticated irony that appealed to contemporary readers. Its intricate plot, with multiple storylines interweaving across 46 cantos, demonstrated Ariosto's narrative virtuosity. Torquato Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered, published in 1581, took a different approach to epic. Where Ariosto was playful and ironic, Tasso was serious and intense. His subject was the First Crusade, the Christian conquest of Jerusalem from the Muslims. The poem combined historical narrative with romantic episodes and supernatural interventions, creating an epic that satisfied counter-Reformation demands for moral seriousness while retaining the imaginative appeal of romance. Tasso's personal life was troubled, and he spent years confined in an asylum, possibly suffering from mental illness or possibly persecuted for religious heterodoxy. The contrast between his brilliant poetry and his personal suffering made him a romantic figure, a type of the tormented artist that would become influential in later centuries. The philosophical tradition that had flourished in Florence under Medici patronage continued in new forms in the 16th century, though under greater constraints imposed by religious authority. The Platonic Academy had dispersed after the fall of the Medici in 1494, and the climate of the Counter-Reformation made speculative philosophy increasingly suspect. Nevertheless, original philosophical work continued. Giordano Bruno, a former Dominican friar, developed a pantheistic philosophy that identified God with the infinite universe. He traveled throughout Europe, teaching and writing, before returning to Italy where he was arrested by the Inquisition. After years of imprisonment, he was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600, a martyr to free thought. Tommaso Campanella, another Dominican friar, spent decades in prison for his unorthodox ideas and his involvement in a conspiracy against Spanish rule in Naples. During his imprisonment, he wrote The City of the Sun, a utopian vision of an ideal society governed by philosophers and organized according to rational principles. The work reflects both Renaissance humanism and counter-Reformation concerns, imagining a society that combines religious devotion with scientific inquiry. Scientific inquiry continued in Italy, despite the constraints of religious authority, preparing the ground for the more dramatic developments of the 17th century. The universities, particularly Padua, remained centers of medical and scientific study. Anatomists continued to explore the structure of the human body. Natural philosophers investigated the properties of matter and motion. Galileo Galilei, born in Pisa in 1564, the year of Michelangelo's death, would become the most important Italian scientist of the following generation. His early work, on the physics of motion and the mathematics of mechanics, was done in the last decades of the 16th century. His astronomical observations with the telescope and his advocacy of the Copernican system would come after 1600, pushing beyond the boundaries of the Renaissance into the scientific revolution of the 17th century. The Renaissance contribution to science was not primarily in specific discoveries, but in attitude and method. The humanist insistence on direct observation, rather than reliance on authority, the artist's practice of close attention to the natural world, the mathematician's confidence that nature could be understood through quantitative analysis, all these contributed to a culture in which scientific inquiry could flourish. The great achievements of 17th century science built on these Renaissance foundations. As we explore the Renaissance, we must also consider those who were largely excluded from its opportunities. Women in Renaissance Italy lived within constraints that limited their participation in public life and cultural achievement, though some remarkable individuals nevertheless made significant contributions. The ideal of the Renaissance woman, as described in conduct literature and reflected in art, emphasized beauty, modesty, and domestic virtue. Women were expected to be chaste before marriage and faithful afterward, to manage their households efficiently, and to provide their husbands with heirs. Education for women was controversial. Some humanists argued that women should receive the same classical education as men, while others insisted that too much learning was inappropriate or even dangerous for women. The reality of women's lives varied enormously depending on social class. Noble and wealthy women had more education and more freedom of movement than their poorer counterparts. They might manage large households, conduct business in their husband's absence, and exercise considerable informal influence. Poor women worked in the fields, in workshops, and as domestic servants, their lives shaped by the constant struggle for survival. The convents provided an alternative path for women, particularly those from elite families who could not be provided with suitable dowries. Convent life offered education, a degree of autonomy, and for some women the opportunity for spiritual and intellectual development. Some convents became centers of learning and artistic production, with nuns writing, composing, and creating works of art within their walls. Despite the constraints they faced, some women achieved recognition as writers and artists during the Renaissance. Their careers were exceptional, requiring either unusual circumstances or extraordinary talent to overcome the barriers that limited most women's opportunities. Vittoria Colonna, a noblewoman who became one of the most celebrated poets of her generation, was a central figure in Roman intellectual life. Her sonnets, many of them mourning her husband who died in 1525, were admired by her contemporaries, including Michelangelo, who became her close friend. Her correspondence with Michelangelo reveals a relationship of mutual respect and intellectual exchange rare between men and women of that era. Veronica Franco, a Venetian courtesan, achieved fame as a poet while pursuing a profession that gave her more independence than most women enjoyed, though at the cost of her reputation. Her poetry combined learned references with frank discussion of her profession, challenging the double standards that condemned women for behavior that was tolerated in men. Sophronisba Anguissola became one of the first women to achieve recognition as a painter. From a noble family in Cremona, she received an education in painting unusual for a woman of her class. Her portraits attracted the attention of Philip of Estu of Spain, who invited her to his court. She painted members of the royal family and taught painting to the queen. Her long career, she lived to be over 90, demonstrated that a woman could succeed as a professional artist despite the obstacles she faced. The Renaissance brought changes in many areas of life, but it did not fundamentally transform the situation of women. The ideals of female beauty and virtue that Renaissance writers celebrated were in many ways continuous with medieval conceptions. The legal subordination of women to their fathers and husbands continued. The opportunities for education and public activity, though somewhat expanded for elite women, remained severely limited. Some historians have asked whether women had a Renaissance at all. If the Renaissance is defined by the revival of ancient learning, the development of new art forms, and the emergence of new ideas about human potential, women participated in these developments to a much lesser degree than men. The great artists and writers of the Renaissance were almost exclusively male. The humanist educational program was designed primarily for men. The political and cultural institutions that supported Renaissance achievement were controlled by men. Yet, women were not merely passive observers of the Renaissance. They were patrons of art and literature, commissioning works and supporting artists. They were audiences for the culture that was produced, readers of poetry and viewers of paintings. And some women were creators themselves, producing works that have only recently received the attention they deserve. The Renaissance was not just a male achievement, even if men dominated its most celebrated expressions. Let us pause once more for rest. Allow your body to settle into complete stillness. Let your breathing become slow and easy, like gentle waves on a calm shore. The ideas and images we have explored can now drift freely through your mind, settling where they will. We have journeyed through challenging times, wars and invasions, religious divisions, the transformation of artistic styles. we have seen how the confidence of the High Renaissance gave way to more complex responses to a more troubled world. Yet even in difficulty, human creativity continued. Artists found new ways to express human experience. Musicians invented new forms. Writers grappled with the great questions of their age. The Renaissance reminds us that creativity is resilient. It can adapt to changing circumstances, finding new channels when old ones are blocked. The achievements of the Italian Renaissance were not destroyed by the disasters that befell Italy in the 16th century. They were transformed and transmitted, spreading to new places and taking new forms. Rest now with these thoughts. Let your mind become quiet and receptive. When you are ready, we will continue our journey, exploring how Renaissance ideas spread across Europe and considering the legacy of this remarkable age. The invasions and disruptions that afflicted Italy in the 16th century had an unexpected consequence. They helped spread Renaissance ideas throughout Europe. Italian artists, scholars, and craftsmen fled the troubled peninsula, carrying their skills and knowledge to courts and cities across the continent. France was particularly receptive to Italian influence. French kings, having invaded Italy and seen its cultural achievements, sought to recreate Italian splendor in their own kingdom. Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547, was an enthusiastic patron of Italian culture. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, where the great artist spent his final years. He employed Italian artists and architects to decorate his palaces. He collected Italian paintings and sculptures, building a collection that would become the nucleus of the Louvre. The school of Fontainebleau, named for the royal palace where it was centered, brought Mannerist style to France. Italian artists including Rosso Fiorentino and Francesco Primaticcio worked alongside French artists, creating a distinctive French version of Italian Renaissance art. This synthesis would influence French art for generations. England, more distant from Italy and distracted by its own religious upheavals, received Italian influence more slowly. But by the later 16th century, Italian ideas were shaping English literature and culture. The sonnet form, developed by Petrarch and his Italian successors, was adapted to English by Wyatt and Surrey and would reach its greatest heights in Shakespeare. Italian political thought, including Machiavelli's provocative ideas, fascinated and disturbed English readers. The spread of Renaissance ideas was enormously accelerated by printing. Books produced in Italy circulated throughout Europe, making Italian learning accessible to readers who would never visit Italy themselves. Translations brought Italian literature to audiences who could not read Italian or Latin. Engravings after Italian paintings spread knowledge of Italian art to artists working in distant places. The printing press also enabled the creation of new kinds of books that spread Renaissance culture. Architectural treatises, including those of Alberti, Serlio, and Palladio, provided models and instructions that architects throughout Europe could follow. Art theoretical writings discussed the principles of painting and sculpture. Emblem books combined images and text in ways that influenced both literature and visual culture. The standardization that printing enabled also contributed to the spread of Renaissance ideas. Before printing, a manuscript might exist in only a few copies, each slightly different from the others. Printing produced hundreds or thousands of identical copies, ensuring that readers in different places were engaging with exactly the same text. This standardization facilitated scholarly communication and the accumulation of knowledge. Renaissance humanism gradually penetrated the universities of Europe, transforming education and scholarship. The medieval universities had been organized around the study of theology, law, and medicine, with the liberal arts serving as preparation for these higher faculties. The humanist program proposed a different kind of education, centered on the study of classical languages and literature. The incorporation of humanism into universities was not always smooth. Traditional scholastic methods had their defenders, and conflicts between humanists and scholastics could be bitter. But gradually, humanist approaches won acceptance. Greek was added to the curriculum alongside Latin. The study of classical texts became central to liberal education. The ideals of eloquence and civic virtue that humanists promoted shaped the education of Europe's elites. This transformation had profound long-term consequences. The educated men, who staffed the governments and churches of early modern Europe, shared a common culture based on classical learning. They could quote the same texts, understand the same allusions, and participate in the same intellectual conversations, regardless of their nationality. This shared culture helped create a European identity that transcended national boundaries. As we approach the end of our journey, let us consider what the Italian Renaissance achieved and how its legacy continues to shape our world. The Renaissance transformed the visual arts. Before the Renaissance, Western art had been predominantly religious in subject and stylized in treatment. The Renaissance created a new kind of art, based on the observation of nature and the mastery of techniques for representing the visible world. The achievements of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael set standards that later artists have sought to match or transcend. The very concept of the individual artist as a creative genius, rather than an anonymous craftsman, emerged from the Renaissance. The Renaissance transformed education. The humanist program, with its emphasis on classical languages and literature, became the basis of elite education throughout the Western world. The ideals of the well-rounded individual, educated in both humanities and sciences, capable of participating in civic life, continue to inform educational philosophy today. The liberal arts curriculum, though much modified over the centuries, traces its ancestry to the Renaissance. The Renaissance transformed political thought. Machiavelli's analysis of power, though controversial, helped establish the study of politics as a discipline separate from theology and ethics. The concept of civic humanism, the idea that educated citizens should participate actively in the governance of their communities, contributed to the development of republican and democratic ideas. The Renaissance contributed to the scientific revolution. Though the great achievements of 17th century science came after the Renaissance proper, they built on foundations laid during this period: the recovery of Greek scientific texts, the development of mathematical analysis, the habit of direct observation, and the confidence that nature could be understood through human reason. The Renaissance has been remembered and interpreted differently by different ages. For the humanists themselves, it was a rebirth after centuries of darkness, a recovery of the glory of antiquity. This self-understanding, while not entirely accurate as a description of the Middle Ages, shaped how later generations would think about the period. The Enlightenment of the 18th century celebrated the Renaissance as a time when reason began to triumph over superstition. The recovery of ancient philosophy, the critique of clerical corruption, the beginnings of scientific inquiry, were all seen as anticipations of the Enlightenment's own project of rational reform. The Romantic era of the 19th century saw the Renaissance differently, emphasizing the emergence of individual genius and creative freedom. The tormented artists, the bold condottieri, the magnificent princes became romantic heroes, models of lives lived with intensity and passion. This romantic image of the Renaissance, though one-sided, had enormous influence on how the period was understood and celebrated. Modern scholarship has complicated these earlier views. Historians have shown that the Middle Ages were not as dark as humanist polemics suggested, and that medieval people had their own valid culture and achievements. They have explored the social and economic foundations of Renaissance culture, moving beyond the celebration of individual genius to understand the conditions that made such genius possible. They have asked about those excluded from Renaissance opportunity: women, the poor, non-Europeans. Yet the achievement remains. Whatever qualifications scholarship may introduce, the Italian Renaissance produced works of art and literature, architectural and musical achievements, political and philosophical ideas that continue to move and instruct us. The questions the Renaissance asked about human nature, about the good life, about the relationship between past and present, are questions we still ask today. As we bring this third part of our journey to a close, let us gather the threads of what we have explored. We have seen how the confidence of the High Renaissance was challenged by war, invasion, and religious division. We have watched as artists develop new styles to express more complex responses to a more troubled world. We have followed the spread of Renaissance ideas across Europe, and considered the legacy that the Renaissance left to later ages. The 16th century was a time of profound transformation, not only for Italy, but for all of Europe. The unity of Western Christendom was shattered by the Reformation. The discovery of new worlds expanded European horizons and challenged old certainties. The development of printing transformed the circulation of ideas. In the midst of all this change, the Italian Renaissance continued to evolve, its achievements spreading and taking new forms in new places. In the final part of our journey, we will explore the later history of Renaissance culture in Italy, following the development of new artistic styles and the continuation of Italian influence into the 17th century and beyond. We will consider how the Renaissance is remembered and what it means for us today. For now, rest peacefully. Let the images and ideas we have explored settle into your mind. The Mannerist painters with their elongated figures and strange colors. The churches of the Counter-Reformation, designed to inspire and awe. The music of the madrigals, expressing every shade of human emotion. The spread of Italian ideas across Europe, carried by books and traveling artists. This is the world of the later Renaissance, a world of change and challenge, but also of continuing creativity. Sleep now, and when you are ready, we will complete our journey together. Welcome to the final part of our journey through Renaissance Italy. As you settle into comfort, allow your breathing to become slow and natural. Let the weight of the day drift away. The story we will tell tonight is one of endings and continuations. Of a great age passing into memory while its achievements endure. We have traced the Renaissance from its origins in the commercial cities of medieval Italy, through its flowering in the 15th century to its transformation in the turbulent 16th. Now we follow the story into its later phases, watching as Italian culture continued to evolve, and as the legacy of the Renaissance was carried forward into the modern world. The Baroque era that followed the Renaissance is sometimes seen as a separate period, with its own distinctive character. But there are continuities as well as changes. The artists of the 17th century built on the foundations laid by the Renaissance masters. The ideas that had emerged in the Renaissance continued to develop and spread. What we call the Renaissance did not end sharply, but gradually transformed into something new. Let this final chapter of our story carry you toward peaceful rest. These tales of artistic achievement and cultural transmission remind us that human creativity links past to present and present to future. The works we will discuss were created centuries ago, but they continue to speak to us, inviting us into worlds of beauty and meaning that transcend their original circumstances. As the 16th century drew to a close, a reaction against the excesses of mannerism began to take shape. Artists and critics increasingly felt that Mannerist sophistication had become empty artifice, that the pursuit of elegance had led painting away from truth and nature. A reform was needed, a return to the principles that had guided the great masters of the High Renaissance. The center of this reform was Bologna, where the Carracci family established an academy dedicated to reviving the best traditions of Italian painting. Annibale Carracci, the most talented of three artist brothers, developed a style that combined the drawing of the Roman tradition with the color of Venice, seeking to synthesize the achievements of the 16th century into a new classical manner. Annibale's masterpiece was the ceiling of the gallery in the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, completed in the early years of the 17th century. This elaborate decoration, depicting mythological scenes of love and transformation, revived the tradition of grand decorative painting that had been established by Michelangelo and Raphael. The ceiling creates an illusion of sculptural frames and painted canvases, playing with the boundary between real and painted space while maintaining a fundamental clarity and order. The Carracci Academy trained many artists who would carry its principles forward. Guido Reni, Domenichino, Guercino, and others developed individual styles within the classical tradition that the Carracci had revived. Their works filled the churches and palaces of 17th century Italy, establishing a standard of dignified beauty that remained influential for centuries. A very different reform was undertaken by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, whose dramatic use of light and shadow and uncompromising naturalism transformed the possibilities of painting. Caravaggio's work was controversial from the beginning and remains powerful and disturbing today. Caravaggio was born in 1571 in, or near the Lombard town whose name he adopted. He came to Rome as a young man and, after a difficult start, attracted the attention of powerful patrons. His early works, depicting young men with fruit and flowers, were notable for their startling realism, rendering every detail of flesh and foliage with unprecedented accuracy. But it was Caravaggio's religious paintings that made his reputation and provoked the most debate. He painted sacred subjects with a naturalism that many found shocking. His figures were not idealized types but specific individuals, their faces and bodies showing the marks of age and labor. He placed biblical scenes in contemporary settings, using ordinary people as models for saints, and even for the Virgin Mary. Most revolutionary was Caravaggio's use of light. His mature works employ a dramatic chiaroscuro, with strong illumination emerging from a dark background to model forms with theatrical intensity. Figures seem to emerge from darkness, their features sculpted by light, the drama of their stories heightened by the contrast between illumination and shadow. The Calling of Saint Matthew, painted for a chapel in Rome around 1600, shows Caravaggio's approach at its most powerful. A beam of light enters from the right, following the pointing hand of Christ, to fall on Matthew sitting at his tax collector's table. The moment of conversion, when Matthew realizes he is being called, is rendered with psychological insight and visual drama that still arrests viewers 4 centuries later. Caravaggio's personal life was as dramatic as his art. He was frequently in trouble with the law, known for brawling and violence. In 1606, he killed a man in a fight and fled Rome. He spent his remaining years in Naples, Malta, and Sicily, creating powerful works while evading justice. He died in 1610, at 38, under mysterious circumstances, perhaps of fever, perhaps of wounds inflicted by his enemies. The influence of Caravaggio was enormous. His dramatic lighting and uncompromising naturalism were taken up by painters throughout Europe. Followers known as Caravaggisti spread his manner to Naples, Spain, the Netherlands, and France. His approach became one of the foundations of Baroque painting, influencing artists as diverse as Rembrandt, Velázquez, and Latour. The early 17th century saw the emergence of a new artistic style that came to be called Baroque. This style, which dominated European art through the 17th century and into the 18th, represented a transformation of Renaissance and Mannerist principles into something new, more dramatic, more emotional, more concerned with overwhelming effect than with quiet harmony. The Baroque style was well suited to the needs of the Counter-Reformation Church. The Council of Trent had called for art that would instruct and move the faithful, that would communicate Catholic teaching clearly and inspire devotion. Baroque art answered this call with images of martyrdom and mystical ecstasy, with church interiors designed to overwhelm the senses and elevate the soul. But the Baroque was not simply religious propaganda. It was also an art of princely magnificence, of royal courts seeking to display their power through architectural splendor and artistic patronage. The Palace of Versailles, though built in France, drew on Italian Baroque traditions. The great estates of the European aristocracy decorated their rooms with Baroque paintings and sculptures. Rome remained a center of Baroque artistic production. The popes of the 17th century, having recovered from the shock of the Reformation, embarked on building programs that transformed the city. New churches rose, their facades articulated with columns and curves, their interiors filled with painted ceilings and sculptural ensembles. New squares were laid out, decorated with fountains and obelisks. Rome became a showcase of Baroque art and architecture, attracting artists from across Europe who came to study and to compete for papal patronage. The dominant artistic personality of Baroque Rome was Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who combined the roles of sculptor, architect, and designer into a career of extraordinary range and influence. Bernini shaped the appearance of Rome more than any artist since Michelangelo, creating works that still define the city's character today. Bernini was born in Naples in 1598, the son of a sculptor who brought him to Rome as a child. His abilities were recognized early as a youth, He created sculptures that astonished connoisseurs with their technical virtuosity and emotional power. By his early 20s, he had become the leading sculptor in Rome, favored by popes and cardinals. Bernini's early sculptures show his revolutionary approach to the medium. The Apollo and Daphne, carved when he was in his mid-20s, depicts the moment when the nymph, fleeing from Apollo's pursuit, begins to transform into a laurel tree. Bark encloses her legs, leaves sprout from her fingers. The transformation is captured at its most dramatic instant, creating an effect of arrested motion that seems to deny the solidity of marble. This quality of dramatic immediacy characterized all of Bernini's mature work. His figures are caught at moments of intense emotion or action. His religious subjects writhe in ecstasy or agony. His portrait busts seem about to speak, their features animated, their garments rippling as if in motion. Bernini's greatest achievements as an architect and designer came in his work for St. Peter's Basilica and its surroundings. The basilica itself had been substantially completed before Bernini's time, but he added crucial elements that transformed the experience of the church. The baldachin, the great bronze canopy over the papal altar, was Bernini's first major work for St. Peter's. This enormous structure, nearly 100 feet tall, marks the spot where St. Peter is believed to be buried. Its twisted bronze columns, decorated with olive and laurel branches, create an effect of opulent splendor that sets the tone for the entire church. At the far end of the basilica, Bernini created the Cathedra Petri, the chair of St. Peter, an elaborate sculptural ensemble that enshrines a wooden chair traditionally believed to have belonged to the apostle. The composition rises from 4 bronze figures of church fathers, supporting the chair to clouds of angels surrounding a window of yellow glass through which light streams, symbolizing the Holy Spirit. The effect is theatrical, designed to inspire awe and devotion. Outside the basilica, Bernini designed the piazza, the great colonnade that embraces the square before the church. 2 curving arms of columns extend from the facade, creating an elliptical space that seems to gather visitors into an embrace. Bernini compared the colonnade to the arms of the church, reaching out to welcome the faithful. The design is both symbolic and practical, providing shelter for crowds gathering for papal ceremonies, while creating a dramatic approach to the greatest church in Christendom. Bernini's religious sculptures express the spiritual intensity of Counter-Reformation Catholicism. His subjects experience divine grace with their whole beings, their bodies responding to spiritual states with physical intensity. The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, created for the Cornaro Chapel in Rome between 1647 and 1652, shows the Spanish mystic in a state of divine transport. An angel holds an arrow with which he is about to pierce her heart. Her face and body express a combination of pain and pleasure that has invited endless interpretation. The scene is staged within an elaborate architectural frame, with members of the Cornaro family depicted in boxes on either side, as if watching a performance. The sculpture is designed to be seen in specific lighting conditions. A window hidden above the composition illuminates the figures with natural light, creating the effect of divine radiance. Bronze rays behind the figures reinforce the impression of supernatural illumination. The whole ensemble is a complete environment, controlling the viewer's experience to heighten the emotional impact. Bernini's other religious works show similar intensity. His late statue of Blessed Ludovica Albertoni, in a Roman church, depicts the dying woman in a state that seems to combine physical suffering with spiritual ecstasy. The rumpled bedding, the twisted body, the face expressing emotions beyond words, all contribute to an image of overwhelming power. Bernini dominated Roman artistic life for over half a century, working for 8 popes and training generations of assistants who carried his methods throughout Europe. His approach to sculpture, architecture, and integrated design became the standard of Baroque practice, but Bernini also had rivals and critics. Some felt that his theatrical effects sacrificed the dignity and restraint appropriate to sacred subjects. The architect Francesco Borromini developed a different approach to Baroque architecture, more focused on geometric complexity than on sculptural drama. The competition between Bernini and Borromini, and the debates it provoked, helped define the range of possibilities within the Baroque style. The Baroque that emerged from Rome spread throughout Catholic Europe. Spanish churches adopted the elaborate decorative programs that Italian models had established. The newly Catholic lands of Central Europe, recovered for the Church after the 30 Years' War, became showcases of Baroque art and architecture. Even Protestant countries felt the influence of Baroque style, adapting it to their different religious and cultural contexts. While Rome was the center of Baroque development, other Italian centers continued their own artistic traditions. Venice, though no longer the dominant maritime power it had been, remained an important center of painting, its artists building on the coloristic tradition established by Bellini, Giorgiani, and Titian. Jacopo Tintoretto, who had been active in Venice since mid-16th century, pointed the way toward Baroque dynamism with his dramatic compositions and rapid brushwork. His vast canvases for the Scuola Grande San Rocco, depicting the life of Christ, created environments of swirling energy that anticipated Baroque aesthetics. Paolo Veronese, Tintoretto's contemporary, developed a different approach, emphasizing magnificence and splendor. His enormous banquet scenes, nominally depicting biblical subjects but populated with elegant Venetians in contemporary dress, celebrated the visual pleasures of Venetian society. Though his inclusion of contemporary elements in sacred subjects attracted the attention of the Inquisition, he defended his practice successfully and continued to produce works of undiminished grandeur. The 17th century saw some decline in Venetian painting from the heights of the previous century, though capable artists continued to work. The tradition of colorism and atmospheric effect remained central to Venetian practice, distinguishing it from the more sculptural and dramatic approaches of Roman art. The 18th century brought a remarkable revival of Venetian painting. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo became the greatest ceiling painter of his age, creating vast compositions of light and color that brought the Baroque decorative tradition to new heights. His frescoes in palaces and churches throughout Europe showed scenes from mythology, history, and religion in settings of dazzling luminosity. Tiepolo's ceilings create convincing illusions of open sky and floating figures. His palette is light and airy, his brushwork fluent and confident. The effect is one of joyous exuberance, a celebration of visual pleasure that seems to transcend the weight of material existence. Canaletto and other view painters created images of Venice that shaped how the city was seen by visitors and foreigners. Their precisely rendered views of canals, palaces, and churches were purchased by travelers on the Grand Tour, carrying images of Venice throughout Europe. These paintings helped establish the romantic vision of Venice that has persisted to the present day. The Venetian school of the 18th century represented the last great flowering of the Italian artistic tradition that had begun with Giotto. When Tiepolo died in 1770, the center of European art had shifted definitively to France and Northern Europe. The Renaissance and its Baroque continuation had run their course in Italy, though their influence would continue to shape Western art for centuries to come. Allow yourself to relax more deeply as we consider the larger context of Italian cultural history. The artistic achievements we have traced took place against a background of political decline. The Italy that had been the richest and most powerful region of Europe in the Renaissance became, by the 17th and 18th centuries, a backwater, divided and dominated by foreign powers. The Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559 had established Spanish hegemony over much of Italy. For the next century and a half, Spanish viceroys ruled Naples and Milan, while Spanish influence dominated the policies of even nominally independent states. The Counter-Reformation Church, headquartered in Rome, maintained enormous influence over Italian society, reinforcing conservative social and intellectual tendencies. The economic decline that accompanied political subjection was gradual but cumulative. The discovery of new trade routes around Africa shifted commercial advantage from the Italian cities to the Atlantic powers. The textile industries that had made Florence rich faced competition from Northern European producers. Population growth stagnated. The dynamism that had characterized Renaissance Italy gave way to stagnation and decay. The 18th century brought new foreign rulers to Italy. After the War of the Spanish Succession, Austria replaced Spain as the dominant power in the peninsula. Lombardy passed to Austrian control. The Bourbons, a branch of the French royal family, ruled Naples. Only Venice and the Papal States maintained genuine independence, and Venice was clearly in decline. Its great days of commercial and naval power long past. Italian intellectuals of the 18th century, influenced by Enlightenment ideas from France and England, were painfully aware of their country's decline. They dreamed of reform and national revival, but the fragmentation of Italy into numerous small states and the resistance of vested interests made change difficult. The Italian Risorgimento, the movement for national unification, would not achieve its goals until the 1860s. The works of art created during the Renaissance faced various fates over the centuries that followed. Many remained in their original locations, maintained by the churches and institutions for which they had been created. Others were collected by princes and nobles, forming the cores of collections that would eventually become public museums. The great collectors of the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly the French and English aristocracy, sought Italian Renaissance works as prizes of cultural sophistication. Old master paintings became status symbols, their ownership demonstrating the taste and wealth of their possessors. This demand created a market that dispersed Italian art throughout Europe and eventually to America. Some works were damaged or destroyed by war, fire, or neglect. Others were transformed by well-meaning but misguided restoration. The Sistine ceiling accumulated centuries of candle smoke and grime before its controversial cleaning in the 20th century revealed the brilliant colors that Michelangelo had originally applied. The institutional care of Renaissance art developed gradually. The idea of the public museum, open to all citizens rather than reserved for princes and their guests, emerged during the Enlightenment. The Uffizi in Florence, originally the offices of the Medici administration, was open to the public in the 18th century. The Louvre in Paris, incorporating the French royal collection, opened in 1793. These and other museums became the primary sites for encountering Renaissance art, replacing the churches, palaces, and private collections where the works had originally been displayed. The 19th century brought a new intensity of interest in the Italian Renaissance. Romantic writers and artists celebrated the period as an age of genius and passion, contrasting it with what they saw as the dull conformity of their own time. The Renaissance became a cultural ideal, a model of what human civilization could achieve when genius was allowed to flourish. This romantic vision of the Renaissance found its most influential expression in the work of the Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt. His Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, published in 1860, presented the Renaissance as the birthplace of modern individualism, a time when people first began to see themselves as unique individuals, rather than merely members of groups and categories. Burckhardt's Renaissance was the period when the state became a work of art, when politics were conducted according to rational calculation, rather than custom and tradition. It was the age of the universal man, the individual of many talents, who developed all aspects of his personality to the fullest. It was the discovery of the world and of man, when observation of nature replaced reliance on authority, and when the inner life of individuals became a subject of interest. This interpretation, though challenged by subsequent scholarship, has remained enormously influential. It shaped how museums presented Renaissance art, how teachers taught Renaissance history, how novelists and filmmakers imagined the period. The idea of the Renaissance as the origin of modernity, as the break with the medieval past that made our world possible, has become common cultural knowledge. 20th and 21st century scholars have complicated the romantic vision of the Renaissance in many ways. They have shown that the Middle Ages were not as dark as humanist polemic and romantic imagination supposed. Medieval people had their own valid culture, their own artistic achievements, their own forms of individualism and observation of nature. They have questioned the sharp boundary between medieval and Renaissance, showing continuities across this supposed divide. The recovery of classical learning that the humanists celebrated had begun in the 12th century, not the 14th. The artistic innovations of the Renaissance built on medieval foundations. The idea of a sudden break, a dramatic rebirth after centuries of darkness, has been revealed as propaganda rather than accurate history. They have explored the social and economic foundations of Renaissance culture, moving beyond the celebration of individual genius to understand the conditions that made such genius possible. The wealth accumulated through trade, the competition among patrons, the institutional structures that supported artistic production, all these have been studied as prerequisites for cultural achievement. They have attended to those excluded from Renaissance opportunity. Women, the poor, non-Europeans, all experienced the Renaissance differently than the elite men who have been its traditional subjects. The glories of Renaissance culture were built on the labor of servants and the subordination of women, achievements purchased at costs that the traditional narrative ignored. Yet even as scholarship has complicated the picture, the Renaissance remains a pivotal period in Western history. The artistic achievements are undeniable. The intellectual and cultural transformations, however we explain them, were real. The legacy of the Renaissance continues to shape our world, from the art in our museums to the liberal education in our universities, to the very concepts we use to think about human nature and potential. The Renaissance lives today in many forms. Its art fills museums that millions of visitors attend each year. Its literature is still read, taught, and adapted. Its architectural legacy shapes the appearance of cities throughout the Western world and beyond. Florence, more than any other city, has become identified with the Renaissance. Tourists crowd the Uffizi to see Botticelli's Birth of Venus. They climb the dome of the cathedral that Brunelleschi built. They stand before Michelangelo's David, now protected behind glass from admirers who want to touch it. The city has become a kind of museum, preserved and displayed for visitors seeking connection with the Renaissance past. Venice too draws millions of visitors each year, though much of what they see is Baroque and later rather than strictly Renaissance. The canals, the palaces, the atmosphere of faded grandeur all evoke a romantic past that tourists seek to experience. The city has become so identified with its historical image that efforts to address contemporary problems, from rising water to over-tourism, face resistance from those who want Venice to remain frozen in its picturesque past. Rome layers Renaissance and Baroque over ancient foundations, the city a palimpsest of European civilization. Visitors move from the ancient Forum to Renaissance St. Peter's to Baroque churches, experiencing 2,000 years of Western history in a few square miles. The crowds that gather in St. Peter's Square, the tourists who strain their necks in the Sistine Chapel, all participate in an ongoing encounter with the Renaissance heritage. As we near the end of our journey, let us reflect on what the Italian Renaissance achieved and what made it possible. These reflections are not merely historical, they speak to enduring questions about human creativity and potential. The Renaissance required wealth. The merchants and bankers of Florence, Venice, and other Italian cities accumulated resources that could be devoted to culture. Without this economic foundation, there would have been no funds for commissions, no leisure for learning, no incentive for artists to develop their skills to the highest levels. The Renaissance required competition. The fragmentation of Italy into numerous states created an environment where patrons competed for the best artists and scholars, driving up quality and rewarding excellence. No single authority could impose uniformity or stifle innovation. The rivalry among cities, courts, and individuals produced an artistic marketplace where talent was recognized and rewarded. The Renaissance required a usable past. The legacy of ancient Rome and Greece provided models that could be recovered, studied, and built upon. The humanists who searched libraries for lost texts and artists who measured ancient ruins were recovering resources that enriched their own culture. The dialogue between antiquity and modernity gave Renaissance culture its distinctive dynamic. The Renaissance required institutions that supported creative work. Workshops trained artists in traditional skills while allowing for innovation. Universities, though sometimes hostile to humanism, provided venues for learning and debate. Churches and confraternities commissioned works and maintained them for centuries. These institutions created environments where culture could flourish and be transmitted across generations. The Renaissance teaches us that great achievements are possible when conditions are favorable. The convergence of wealth, competition, cultural inheritance, and institutional support in Renaissance Italy produced a flowering of human creativity that still inspires us today. These conditions can be cultivated. They are not simply accidents of history. The Renaissance teaches us that tradition and innovation are not opposites. The humanists who revered antiquity used their knowledge of the past to create something new. The artists who studied Giotto and Masaccio developed techniques that those masters could not have imagined. Creativity does not require rejecting the past but engaging with it, learning from it, building upon it. The Renaissance teaches us that human beings are capable of remarkable achievements. The works of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and countless others demonstrate what human skill and dedication can accomplish. This is not to deny that genius is rare, or that most of us will not match such achievements, but it reminds us that human potential is great, and that conditions can be created that allow it to flourish. The Renaissance also teaches us about the limits and costs of cultural achievement. The glories of Renaissance art were created by societies that excluded women, exploited the poor, and rested on inequalities we now condemn. The recovery of ancient learning did not prevent religious wars or colonial conquest. Culture alone does not make us good. Beauty and justice are not the same thing. The Renaissance is not merely a historical period, safely contained in the past. It is a living legacy that continues to shape our present and will influence our future. Every time we enter a museum to see Renaissance paintings, every time a student studies the humanities, every time an architect draws on classical forms, the Renaissance is renewed. This legacy is not fixed or unchanging. Each generation encounters the Renaissance through its own concerns and perspectives. The Renaissance we see today is not the same as the Renaissance that 19th century romantics celebrated or that 20th century social historians analyzed. Our understanding continues to evolve as new questions are asked and new evidence is discovered. What remains constant is the encounter with works that transcend their historical circumstances. When we stand before the Mona Lisa or walk into St. Peter's or read Machiavelli's Prince, we are not merely studying the past. We are participating in an ongoing conversation about beauty, power, human nature, and the meaning of life. The Renaissance speaks to us because it addressed questions that remain vital, and it addressed them with an intensity and skill that command our attention. As we prepare for our journey's end, let us settle into deep peace. Allow your body to become completely still. Let your breathing become slow and easy, like the gentle rhythm of waves on a calm shore. Let your mind become quiet, open, receptive. We have traveled far together, through 5 centuries of Italian history, through the workshops of Florence and the palaces of Rome, through war and plague and religious division, through triumph and decline. We have met artists of extraordinary genius and patrons of remarkable ambition. We have considered ideas that transformed human understanding of art, nature, politics, and the self. The Renaissance was created by human beings who were not so different from us. They faced their own challenges and uncertainties. They experienced joy and sorrow, success and failure, hope and fear. In the midst of their ordinary lives, they created extraordinary things, works that have outlasted their makers by centuries, and will continue to inspire as long as human culture endures. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of this great human story. The creativity that flourished in Renaissance Italy is the same creativity that lives in every human being. The desire to make beautiful things, to understand the world, to leave something of value for those who come after, these are universal human impulses that connect us across time and space. Sleep now, and let the Renaissance live in your dreams. The dome of Florence rises against the sky. The canals of Venice shimmer in the afternoon light. The figures on the Sistine ceiling reach toward each other across the painted heavens. This is your inheritance, the gift of those who came before, waiting for you whenever you choose to receive it. Our journey through Renaissance Italy is complete. We have traced the origins of the Renaissance in the wealthy cities of medieval Italy, watching as commerce and competition created conditions for cultural flowering. We have explored Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, meeting the Medici and the artists they patronized. We have walked with the great masters of the high Renaissance: Leonardo, with his insatiable curiosity; Michelangelo, with his titanic creative power; Raphael, with his perfect grace. We have seen how Venice developed its own distinctive tradition of color and light, and how the smaller courts of northern Italy cultivated learning and refinement. We have followed the Renaissance through turbulent times, the wars that devastated Italy, the religious divisions that split Christendom, the social and political changes that transformed European society. We have watched as Mannerism replaced classical harmony, and as Baroque drama eventually succeeded Mannerist sophistication. We have considered the spread of Renaissance ideas throughout Europe, and their transformation in new contexts. We have reflected on the legacy of the Renaissance, on how it has been remembered and reinterpreted over the centuries, and on what it means for us today. The Renaissance matters because it shows what human beings can achieve. In a few centuries, in a small region of southern Europe, people created works of art and thought that continue to move and instruct us today. They developed techniques and ideas that transformed Western culture and, through Western influence, the entire world. The Renaissance also matters because it raises questions that remain unresolved. How should we balance tradition and innovation? What makes some periods more creative than others? How can we build societies that allow human potential to flourish? What are the costs and limits of cultural achievement? These questions cannot be answered once and for all, but the Renaissance provides a rich resource for thinking about them. As you drift towards sleep, let these questions rest easy. There is no need to resolve them tonight. Simply let them be, along with all the images and ideas we have explored. The beauty of a Botticelli painting, the drama of a Caravaggio canvas, the grandeur of St. Peter's Square, the quiet intimacy of a Venetian interior. All these are yours, part of your human inheritance, waiting for you whenever you wish to return. Good night, traveler through time. May your dreams be touched by the beauty we have explored together. May you wake refreshed, carrying something of the Renaissance spirit with you into the new day. May the creativity and aspiration that flourished in Italy inspire your own endeavors, whatever they may be. The Renaissance is not merely history. It is a continuing invitation to excellence, a reminder of what human beings can achieve when conditions are favorable and talent is cultivated. Every encounter with Renaissance art, every reading of Renaissance literature, every reflection on Renaissance ideas renews this invitation. It is extended to all of us, across the centuries, in every age. Sleep well, and when you wake, remember that you too are part of the great human story. The artists and scholars of the Renaissance are your ancestors in spirit, if not in blood. Their achievements are your inheritance. Their questions are your questions. Their creativity flows through you, waiting to find its own expression. Farewell to Renaissance Italy. But not goodbye, for the Renaissance never truly ends. It continues wherever human beings strive for beauty, seek understanding, and dare to believe that the world can be made better than they found it. Sleep now.